I have no memory of that, Senator. Go ahead. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the 2025 Ashbrook Academic Conference. My name is Matt Savage. I will be hosting our first panel of the day. And on that panel, we have closest to me, Dr. Aaron Pullin, who is a professor of history and Asian studies at Carthage College. His primary teaching and research interests address the international relations between India and the United States during the 20th century. He also teaches courses on the history of India, the history of the United States, international heritage, global heritage, and the history of dictionaries. To his left, we have Dr. David Hadley, who is an associate professor of history at the National Defense University. His field of expertise is modern U.S. history, with a specific focus on the history of U.S. diplomacy and the history of intelligence and espionage in the Cold War. His first book, The Rising Clamor, examined the relationship that developed between the CIA and U.S. print media during the early decades of the CIA's existence. He is currently researching the legacy of the Office of Strategic Services. And finally, we have Dr. David Krugler, who is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, a historian of the modern United States. He has published books on several different topics: Cold War propaganda, nuclear warfare, and racial conflict in the United States. He is the author of 4 books on modern U.S. history and 2 novels, both World War II spy thrillers, The Dead Don't Bleed and Rip the Angels from Heaven. Each of them will be giving a presentation, and then after that, we will have a question and answer period from the audience. And with that, I'd like to ask Dr. Pullin to please start.
Thank you very much. So if you look at the slide, it says, "Leave India to God, leave her to anarchy." This is a famous quotation from the Mahatma Gandhi, who is demanding that the British Empire leave India during World War II. In fact, leave during the worst part of World War II for the Allies, which was 1942. Now, Gandhi would neither have, let me phrase it like this. Gandhi would have no influence as to when the British would leave, nor how the British would leave. In fact, they didn't leave in the manner that he'd hoped. So, John, that's good. So we will, as we look at this slide, we have, we'll start like this. We have 2 images. These are both images are of the British Indian Army's 1st Sikh Battalion. They are both images of honor and shame. On the top, what we see are essentially British troops, Sikhs, fighting against the Japanese in Burma. And below, what we see are Sikhs, probably also from the 1st Battalion, plotting the military murder of civilians in India after World War II. So there are basically 2 approaches I'm going to take here. The narrative approach that I'm going to take for the presentation is that India's significant involvement in the extended violence of World War II has been largely forgotten. Second, which will form the argument, is that especially between 1945 and 1947, this forgotten story is both majestically heroic and epically horrifying. So, Winston Churchill famously said before the Canadian Parliament on December 30th, 1941, "When I warned the French that Britain would fight on alone, whatever they did, their generals, the French generals, said, in 3 weeks, England will have her neck wrung like a chicken." Some chicken, some neck. Gets great applause. People love this. This phrase is defiant. It's eloquent. It's inspiring. It's legendary. And I have to admit that this type of rhetoric still gives me chills. Makes me want to enlist in the British Army, the RAF, the Royal Navy. No, definitely not the Royal Navy. But at the risk of sounding catty, these inspiring words were easier to say after Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union and Pearl Harbor, than they were during Dunkirk or the Battle of Britain. Nevertheless, Churchill's rhetoric serves as a very poignant reminder, not only to the British people, but to the British allies and to history, that the British Isles faced an isolated and dire position during the very first dark years of World War II. This is a very familiar story. So if we look at the map, we see that from the, at least from a version of, from the view of continental Europe, Britain is in fact isolated. On September 1st, 1939, Germany attacks Poland, of course. On September 3rd, Germany and France declare war on Germany. Then by June 1940, Germany has invaded Western Europe, conquered Netherlands, Belgium, France, basically leaving only a handful of German-leaning neutral countries to face Britain on the European continent that have been left unconquered. Now, if you look at the map also, you'll see a number of blue portions. Those are French colonies, especially on the southern part of the map, like Syria or Morocco, Algeria on the southern part of the map. And they have essentially become French puppets and thus British puppets. So really, Britain has no continental allies. By April 1941, the situation is even more bleak. As Nazi Germany invades Yugoslavia in April and Greece in April. If you look at the map, they're gray, but they will become part of the German Empire. And then Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria will lurch towards an alliance with Germany. The only thing that really changes, but it's a significant change, is what happens on June 22nd, 1941. That's Operation Barbarossa, in what is perhaps the most unsurprising surprise invasion in military history. It's always curious to me that Stalin and Hitler had this non-aggression pact because each one thought he was outweighing the other, and Stalin always thought the invasion would happen tomorrow. But it eventually happened, and basically what happened is now Britain has a friend. But if we move to the international map, we see that Britain is anything but isolated. One glance at this map shows that Britain did not stand alone. On the contrary, Britain possessed the largest empire in human history. And when you look at that empire, India is the most significant portion of that empire. While Nazi Germany controls Europe, Britain controls a truly global empire. Now, I'm not trying to insult or diminish Britain's courage and determination. In fact, I think Britain truly deserves our admiration. But one nevertheless has to concede that Britain had an awful lot of help when it fought Germany. Again, a brief look at the map shows us that Britain controls the planet's most important shipping lanes and strategic choke points. These geostrategic positions enabled Britain to dominate direct access to the planet's most valuable resources. They included foodstuffs such as livestock, grains, water, mineral wealth, rubber, timber, pharmaceutical staples, and petroleum. And I haven't even really begun the list. Another glance at the map shows us that Britain's empire gave it astonishing access to human resources. In 1940-41, the British Empire controlled a global system that comprised between 400 million and 500 million people, which then was approximately a quarter of the Earth's population. During World War II, the British Empire placed 25 million people into uniform. The British Isles and the White Dominions, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they together contributed roughly half of the fighting forces that would serve the British Empire during World War II. The other rough half of Britain's empire, or rather its manpower contingent, was rounded out by military personnel from the British Empire's non-white colonies. And these include the West African colonies, East Africa, and especially India. Keep in mind that the bulk of forces who formed the British Isles military during World War II were conscripted. This means they were drafted. So the British themselves, and the white Commonwealth countries tended to draft their military personnel. But Britain's colonies, however, they made the overwhelming number of their contributions through volunteer recruitment. Let me say that again, volunteer recruitment. Colonies such as Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Kenya, South Africa, and India all contributed massive numbers of volunteer military personnel to fight the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. Without disparaging the contributions of Britain's predominantly white colonies, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, or the other colonies like Ghana or Nigeria, no colony in the British Empire contributed more to the war effort than did India. In fact, I'd like to get your heads around this number. India contributed 2.5 million soldiers for military service during World War II. That's the largest volunteer army in the history of armed conflict. Let's see, the reasons for this we can talk about in another discussion. I'm going to pass over that, but I think it is important to say that Indians served in every theater of the war in which Britain fought, and that India's contribution to Britain's war effort proved not only significant, but indispensable. India's contribution becomes even more noticeable when we observe that the British Empire lost 400,001 soldiers during World War II. Of those 400,001, nearly 25% of them were Indian. Roughly 90,001 were killed fighting Germans, Italians, and Japanese. If it seems strange to you that I'm saying I'm not using round numbers, I'm borrowing from a historian named Tim Snyder, who always, when he has round numbers, adds a 1, no matter what the round number is, because when you look at the deaths of so many people, you round out a number, it just seems like a vague number. You add a 1 to it, it doesn't change the number, really. But what it does is remind you that every death that I've just mentioned is a human story. I think that's important. So I'm now adding 1 to everything, irrespective of whether I'm talking about the Eastern Front, the Western Front, or whatever conflict. All right. Now, if Britain appears to fight, or appears to have fought alone, I think it's more fair to say that Britain fought together. Let's take a brief, take a look at this propaganda poster and see some of the things you notice. But British propagandists during the World War II rarely acknowledged the multi-ethnic composition of British forces during World War II. And as this poster, which says together, indicates, half of the British military was non-white. But if you look at it, it's 5/7 of the military is white. Now, let's just go from right to left, which means you're going to have to go up and down. But on the left, you see a West African soldier wearing a slouch hat. Below him is a British soldier wearing a pith helmet. Go up, what you see is an Indian soldier in the turban, but he's ambiguously identified. You can't really tell if he's a Sikh, a Muslim, or a Rajput Hindu. And I think that's a deliberate choice in terms of propaganda. Below him would be a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Next to him, an Australian in slouch hat. And then next to him, of course, a British member of the Royal Navy. This propaganda poster was extremely popular, or at least the government thought it was during World War II. But it really, it really gives short shrift to the non-white contribution of the British Empire during World War II. Nevertheless, this slogan "Together" was necessary because it was important for the British, not only at home, but especially in the empire, to acknowledge the diverse nature of its war effort. Now, this is just sort of a fun moment for me, but when I was a kid in the 1970s, I used to play with Airfix, not toys, but action figures. And they were, every unit in the world, Japanese Marines, Japanese infantry, British Marines, 8th Army, etc. But what's noteworthy to me about this is I look back and this is sort of an unimportant but nostalgic moment for me is, yeah, I played with this stuff. It's great. But I never really had a sense of the multi-ethnic nature of the British Eighth Army. A second more crucial point is that if we look at these air-fixed soldiers, they are all white. And particularly the British Eighth Army, which was arguably, but not much arguably, Britain's most prestigious infantry unit during the Second World War. It saw combat from the beginning of the war until the end of the war. And I think the only possible, people can argue with me later about this, I think the only comparable U.S. unit in the Army would be the U.S. First Division. But beyond that, you get no sense that it's a multi-ethnic unit, and that it was a truly combined effort. All right. So this is the famous watercolor by Anthony Gross of the 4th Indian Division. And one of the things you'll notice is that you will see white and brown troops in the canteen, the 8th Army. But just as importantly, you will see diversity among the Indians. You'll see Rajputs, you'll see Sikhs, you'll see soldiers who were possibly Muslim, and Hindus who were not Rajput. And it's really a remarkable homage to the diversity of the British Eighth Army. I want to tell you about the makeup of the British Eighth Army. Half of the troops were from either Britain or the half of the troops were from Britain. Of the 8 divisions of the Eighth Army, 5 were from Britain, 2 were from Australia and New Zealand, and 2 were from India. So the British Army, British Eighth Army, really deserves a certain amount of recognition here. Now let's go back to the activities of the British Eighth Army and maybe move to the next slide. Indians participated in numerous battles throughout World War II. They were in the battles of North Africa, which included El Alamein, the Gazala offensive, the Mareth Line in Tunisia, the invasion, and then later the invasion of Sicily. They participated in the crawl up the Italian boot in Italy. And then later in 1945, they would storm the German Gothic line and then play an absolutely indispensable role, at least for the British, in the German offensive, the offensive against Germany in the spring of '45. Now, if we go to slides 10 and 11, we realize that it's not just Europe where the Indians participated. They also participated in the Pacific. On December 7th and 8th, 1941, Japan began what was probably, at least in my opinion, the most amazing military operation in human history. I say amazing because of its complexity and the absolute scale of what Japan did. They attacked from Pearl Harbor to Indonesia, from Hong Kong to Malaya. It is, and by a certain measure, during that period, by spring 1942, Japan would control the largest empire in human history, at least as measured in square miles, and if we include the vast expanses of the Pacific. But by any measure, their achievement was remarkable. Let's see, where are we here in my notes? Yes, what am I doing here? There we go. Let's get in order, Pullin. If we go to the next slide, this is Malaya, which is now the country of Malaysia. And if you look at the very bottom here, in yellow, you'll see an island. That's today the country of Singapore. Japan conquered Singapore. When Japan conquered Singapore, there were 80,000 British troops guarding Malaya and Singapore. Of those 80,000 troops, 50,000 of them, more than half of the troops, were Indians, like the soldiers you just saw in the last slide. If we go to the next slide, we will see that when Britain surrenders, more than half of and this is what Churchill called Britain's greatest defeat, by the way. If we go to the next slide, what we see is more than half of those Indian soldiers defected from the British Army into what would become known as the Indian National Army, led by Subhas Chandra Bose, who fought for initially tried to fight for the Germans and then would fight for the Japanese. Problems for the Japanese, though, is that they had absolutely no regard racially for Indians, regarded them as inferior, dismissed them as a fighting force, and used them as nothing but propaganda. So these soldiers would basically be shunted to the side for the rest of the war. Those Indian soldiers who did not defect to India became prisoners in the Japanese prisoner of war system. And I'm just reminded of that famous movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai, with the great whistling and Alec Guinness's magnificent performance. But you don't see a single Indian soldier in that prison camp, and you should have. It should have been at least half filled with Indians. Let's see. Now, if we move to yet the next slide, we realize that what the Indians are doing is forming the bulk of Britain's fighting forces in Asia Pacific, and particularly in Burma. In Burma, which is located right next to India, and Burma was the rice belt, or it was the breadbasket, basically the rice bowl is what I think they say, of Asia. And Britain and Japan were fighting on this over Burma. Burma was the gateway to India for Japanese invasion, but it's Indian troops who stopped the Japanese from advancing in Burma, and then eventually pushed back the Japanese in Burma. And let me just give you a little fact here. Of the nearly 500,000 soldiers that fought British soldiers that fought the Japanese in Burma during 1944, 1945, 340,000 of them were Indian, as opposed to 100,000 British soldiers taken either from the British Isles or the Commonwealth. During this conflict, 28,001 Indians were killed in action, or British were killed in action. Over 20,000 of them were Indian. During this conflict, of the 31 Victoria Crosses awarded by the British to Indians, 20 of them were awarded to Indians during the Burma conflict. Now, if you don't know, the Victoria Cross is the British equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor. There's no higher honor in the British military. As I said, the Indians of the Burma campaign not only conducted the bulk of British operations during this intense battle, but they protected India from Japanese invasion. And eventually, by 45, they defeated the Japanese in Burma. Now, if we go to the next two or three slides, let's just take a look at some of these soldiers. Gosh, except for the skin color, they look exactly like British Tommies. And with regard to their fighting ability and the contribution that they made to the war effort, they were effectively British Tommies. Or let's phrase it differently. Britain could not have, British Tommies would not have succeeded without what the Indians called a Javan. And these are good examples of them here and in the next slide. These soldiers as they slogged through the Burmese jungle. I think we might have one more slide. No, all right, let's pause there for a moment. Now, Britain could not have won the war without its Indian soldiers. Now, whether guarding oil fields in the Middle East, standing as reserve troops in India and throughout the British Empire, fighting as desert rats in North Africa, storming the beaches in Italy, or suffering in the jungles of Burma, the Indians of the British Army deserve a recognition for their distinction and historic service during World War II. Sadly, I think it's a distinction that is forgotten by most historians who study World War II. Now, despite the nobility of this story, there is a very dark and horrifying aspect to the story of Indian service during World War II. When Indian soldiers returned to India in 1945, they returned to a nation that was seething with violence, with violence as the British Empire would divide itself into the countries of India and Pakistan. The independence and partition of India, despite Gandhi's famous civil disobedience and his famous calls for nonviolence, was incredibly violent. There was nothing peaceful about the transition or of India from empire to independence or the decolonization of Britain. On the contrary, it's one of the most violent conflicts of the 20th century. In the precisely 2 years, August 15th, 1945, the formal surrender of the Japanese, to August 15th, 1947, the formal independence and partition of India. I need you to get your heads around this figure. So let me phrase it like this. World War II did not end for India in 1945. It ended in 1947. But in those 2 years, more than 1,500,001 Indians were murdered or killed in the violence of partition. And that is after the surrender flags were raised in World War II. And not only that, but 17,000,001 refugees were permanently displaced after World War II in India. This is not something that you will see in most histories of World War II. Usually they're shunted off into specific histories of India and not connected directly to World War II. How do they relate directly to World War II? Because what Britain did inadvertently was that it created killing squads that would contribute to this mass destruction in India. Now, although they acted heroically in the British Army during World War II, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims trained in the art of war would return back to their home communities and face what was known as communal or sectarian violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. And they would use this training, they would use their weapons, and they would gather as paramilitary units, often murdering civilians by the thousands. There would be pitched battles. There's essentially a guerrilla civil war that is waged for 2 years in India. Let's go to the next slide, if we may. I want to say that these soldiers, these are Sikh soldiers in Amritsar, veterans of North Africa and Italy, scouring the streets for Muslim victims. In the next slide, what we see is Muslim soldiers protecting a caravan of Muslim refugees on the run from Hindu paramilitary groups. And in the next slide, what we see are Hindus looking for Muslims, contraband, or weapons. What we see really is that one of the very sad unintended consequences of World War II is that Britain desperately needed India's manpower in order to fight the war, but then really didn't know what to do when it demobilized that manpower. And then when that manpower was demobilized, it found outlets that to this day shame India, whether Muslim, Sikh, or Hindu, to a great extent. I just want to point out that if we look at the numbers of the British Indian Army, 50% of them were Hindu, 30% were Sikh, and 30% were Muslim, and 20% were Sikh. The numbers might suggest that each group would hold its own, but the Muslims fared very badly against the Sikhs and the Hindus because Muslims are spread all over India and they are not highly concentrated except in the west and the east, where there are very few Hindus and Muslims. But in the region of the Punjab, there is a blend of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. If you look at the combination of soldiers, the number of I'm going to answer. The number of Muslims was always at a disadvantage. So Muslims were never able quite to fight or defend themselves against their Sikh and Hindu adversaries. So I think, believe it or not, I'm actually really close to finishing. And what I'm going to say is this, and I might read this just so that I stay on time. India possesses today the largest population on the planet, yet its contribution to World War II is largely forgotten or recognized by historians of World War II. Let's just review a few details. India contributed 2.5 million volunteers to the British war effort, without which Britain could not have survived against Germany, Italy, or Japan. Of the 400,001 British dead, nearly 1/4 of them were Indians. However, training and mobilization of these troops, or through British or mobilization of these troops, Britain inadvertently created tens of thousands of soldiers who would serve as killing squads during the period of independence and partition between 1945 and 1947. Thus, World War II in India did not end in 1945 with a convenient date. On the contrary, India's participation in World War II left more than 1,500,001 Indians dead after the Japanese surrender, and more than 15 million people permanently displaced from their homes. Despite the best intentions of the British and British nationalists, World War II left India not to God as Gandhi had hoped, but to anarchy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pullin.
I'll be signing autographs afterwards.
Dr. Hadley.
Oh,
Wait, sorry, is it Dr. Krugler?
I'm fine with whatever. I thought.
Okay, sorry, I was just going down the line.
There we go.
Sorry. Dr. Krugler.
Thank you. So to
Apologies.
start my address, I'd like to thank the Prussian Cultural Foundation of Berlin for its financial support for the research that informs my presentation. I'd like to make 5 points at the onset. First, in the wake of World War I, air defense, that is, preparation for air attacks on civilian populations, particularly in cities, became a priority for the German state. This is long before the Nazis took power. And air defense became a powerful propaganda tool to vilify the Versailles Treaty and to support German remilitarization. Second point, air defense was more than propaganda. Particularly after the Nazis took power and started war in Europe, the German state undertook extensive preparations to ready the civilian populations to defend themselves and to recover from Allied aerial attacks. These preparations were largely effective. It was only late in the war that the sheer tonnage of Allied bombing overwhelmed German air defense. And let me give you a brief statistic to illustrate that. Between September 1944 and April 1945, the Allies used more than 800,000 tons of bombs against German targets. That's 60% of the total used between 1939 and 1945. This put the German economy on the brink of failure, as Albert Speer would tell Hitler in early 1945. The number of lives lost is best calculated for Germany at 353,001 by the war's end. A lot of sources will give 600,000, but I'm relying here on the historian Richard Overy, who puts it at 353,000. The reason we're not able to calculate with great accuracy is because, as Dr. Citino pointed out yesterday, the Germans lost a lot of records. And when we see some of the photographs, you'll certainly understand that. Another point, perhaps the most important question arising from this topic is, did Allied bombing undermine support for the Nazi regime, which was one of the stated objectives of Allied bombing? And here I'll reinforce what Dr. Citino said. It did not. As he pointed out, civilians who had lost homes, loved ones who were injured, whose places of work were no longer operable, they were dependent on the German state. And early in the war, early in the bombing process, the Germans took steps to ensure that dependency. But I would like to modify this accepted notion that Allied bombing didn't undermine German support for the fascist regime. That is true, but when we think about morale, we must also think about the effect on people. And the bombing did terrorize Germans. It did terrorize them. In that sense, there is a diminishment of morale because terrified people are not the most effective workers they can be. If they're terrified of bombing and all their energy, mental and physical, goes toward preparations for that, that does weaken the state in a sense. Let's advance the slide, please. Oh, I got it. All right, so there we go. All right, so 2.1, air defense, or in German Luftschutz, as propaganda. Here we see the cover of a magazine, which translates as the Siren, which began publishing in 1933 after the Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, set up the State Air Defense League. But this was preceded by private organizations to promote air defense. These were done through leagues, or in German, Vereins, primarily propaganda outfits. What was the propaganda put forward? Number one, that Germany was helpless against future attacks from its enemies. And that tells us something very important about how the Versailles Treaty was received. A second point of propaganda, the civilian population must serve as a significant backstop to the military, particularly since the Versailles Treaty has hamstrung Germany's ability to have an army and prohibited an air force. We see this in propaganda targeting even children, as an image from this 1936 picture book shows. Rolf Mutig practices air defense. By the way, mutig is the German word for courageous. Once the Germans came into power, the Nazis took over the German state, they folded in these private efforts and this propaganda into an organization that set up this effective air defense, as said, but also built upon the propaganda base to create the Nazi notion or ideal of the German folk, of a Gemeinschaft, a community that, of course, was based on a racist and violent ideology. Some of this propaganda would talk of the need for the German people to have the will to power, drawing on Nietzsche and corrupting Nietzsche to promote Nazism, but fold it into air defense. What did air defense look like? Let me highlight some features of it, and then we'll turn to the effects of the bombing itself. First important point, this civil defense apparatus was militaristic in structure, especially when compared to Britain, and it formed an enormous core of trained volunteers and people dedicated to not only building shelters where they worked and lived, but also volunteering to train in medical services, firefighting, and evacuation. So in 1939, the year the war began, the Reichsluftschutzbund, the State Air Defense League, had 15 million members. That increased to 22 million by 1942. This is almost 25% of the German population. Volunteerism resulted in more than 2,000 local branches, 400,000 officials, and 3,400 air defense schools. A 1937 law created categories of so-called self-defense, Selbstschutz. Germans were expected to have shelters where they lived, but also where they worked. And there was also a category for when people were out of the home, at the cinema, for example, to find places to take shelter. The core of the air defense apparatus was the warden. And like wardens in the civil defense apparatus here in the United States during World War II, they were volunteers, men and women, as we see here in these two images. On the left, Frau im Luftschutz, a woman in air defense. And so the typical or ideal Aryan female is shown there. And then in the photograph, we see female volunteers in the city of Worms in 1939. 200,000 wardens were women early in the war, and that number increased as the war went on. The German civil defense apparatus included an extensive system of blackouts, of building state shelters, and so on. But the German civil defense system was not entirely effective. The German government and German society chronically struggled to build shelters and to have sufficient shelters. For example, during the first year of the war, 1939, the capacity for Hamburg was just 7,000, 88 public shelters for 7,000 people, yet the population was 1.7 million. Now that gap is offset by people building shelters in their homes, but still, if they're out of their home or out of work when an air raid takes place, there's not going to be sufficient public shelter. The city of Münster had just shelter space for 3.3% of its population. People were urged to do more, as this poster from the Luftwaffe shows. Hermann Göring telling civilians the air defense fighter is as important or has as much responsibility and as much honor as the soldier on the front. Here we turn to another interesting feature of German civil defense, and one that created problems as Allied bombing steps up significantly. Meddling by Hitler. And I want to reinforce a point made by Dr. Citino that when we look at Hitler's track record during the war, we really see a pattern of blunders, of delusion, of incompetence, and outright insanity. And we see some of this early in the war when Hitler takes interest in the construction of bunkers. So in the fall of 1940, he issued an order to construct bomb shelters in Berlin, the capital, for women and children. And initially he said, we need to have 1,000 bunkers. They must have comfortable sleeping space and be quiet. Now think about that. He's asking bomb raid shelters to be so well built that they'll be quiet during a bomb raid so that mothers and their children can sleep comfortably. Another requirement he put in place, or another expectation, was that the new bunkers to be built should serve as the foundations for future government buildings. So he's thinking ahead, we're going to win this war, and as we repair from the damage the Allies will inflict upon us, the shelters that have saved our superior racial German population will serve as the post-war right. We'll expand our power in that way. Hitler also ordered that whatever workers were needed would be put forward to this. His building officials were estimating 30,000. Hitler was also saying this is a financial priority, but the reality was there weren't enough workers, even though the Germans used enslaved labor to build some of these shelters that actually were constructed, and there simply wasn't enough money. Another example of this problem comes from the city of Aachen, which is on the German-Belgian border, and we'll soon see a map depicting Aachen. In fact, we can go to that map right now. It's a very busy one, but if you follow the German-Belgian border, you should be able to pick out the city of Aachen. There, in the fall of 1939, civil defense officials requested money and equipment to retrofit a high school with a ventilation system. This request was denied. So too other requests to retrofit the technical school. This is a representative example of other requests coming in and being denied. There simply wasn't enough money. Yet Hitler continued to believe and insist that sufficient shelters could be built. Another problem resulting from Hitler's meddling, and this speaks to a systemic flaw in the Nazi regime: bureaucratic infighting and turf battles over civil defense. So as said, civil defense was housed in the Luftwaffe, but Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's head of the police, wanted to take as much power over civil defense as possible. Why? Because he saw this as a way to expand his power and authority and that of the police, and use civil defense officials, firefighters, wardens, etc., as a way to monitor the population. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels, the head of propaganda, also wanted power over civil defense. And in the interest of time, I'll summarize this infighting with this stylized but still evidence-backed anecdote. Imagine these two, Himmler and Goebbels, scurrying to Hitler when the other one wasn't around and taking his ear and saying, I need this, and getting Hitler to issue an order. Then Himmler finds out what Goebbels has done, and he goes to Hitler and gets yet another order to expand his authority. This created trouble for civil defense. And at one point in the war, officials were saying, who's in charge here? And many of them simply gave up and said, well, we're not going to worry about Berlin. We're going to focus on what we have to do here. And what they had to do here was tremendous. So here we see B-17 bombers over Germany in 1944, the smoke bomb marking the targets. One of the objectives of Allied strategic bombing to take out Germany's transportation network. This was successfully achieved throughout much of the war, as this photograph shows us. Destroyed rail yards in the German city of Celle, which is in eastern Germany, after a bombing very late in the war. Germans quickly found that despite their extensive preparations, this was a terrifying, deadly experience. Even for those who survived in the shelters, there was claustrophobia, darkness, inadequate facilities. Often people suffocated to death in the shelters. For those who were not in the shelters, hazards included delayed fuse bombs that killed and maimed first responders and created additional fires. The German state was prepared to deal with the damage. And as the RAF began systemic bombing in the spring of 1940, the German state made two key decisions and actions that would be difficult to sustain. One, they told workers that they would be compensated for lost time because of bombing. But at this point, the Germans thought, okay, the British are just trying to terrify the population and not take out our infrastructure and our industry. But as that happened, as this photograph shows, it became more and more difficult for the German state to economically sustain this compensation policy. And one way they coped with it was to shorten the time for workers to leave their posts and go to their work shelters. It was taken down to 6 minutes after the air raid siren sounded. The other and more consequential decision was to compensate German civilians for lost possessions, for repairs of homes, and replacement of homes that could not be repaired. And early in the war, the German state reallocated stolen Jewish property and homes to civilians who lost those items or lost housing. And so not only is that a significant form of compensation, but it's yet again proof of how deeply implicated the German civilian population was in Nazi anti-Semitism and the deportations that enable the Holocaust. For those of you who were present last night at the Ashland Theater to see The Best Years of Our Lives, you may recognize the reference to Dusseldorf. One of the protagonists of the movie, Fred, is a bombardier who loses his pilot in a raid over Dusseldorf. It gives him PTSD. Here's a photo of one of the many, many bombing raids that hit that city in 1944. Now, Professor Citino mentioned the pulverization of German cities and reduced to rubble. And that's true in a sense, but as this photograph shows, cities were not completely destroyed. Not even Dresden was completely leveled. But this photo, which is representative, reminds us that the damage was extensive, and particularly late in the war, repair is simply not possible. To drive this point home, I'd like to share with you a report that came from the city of Aachen after a July 14th air raid. This is in 1943. The raid lasted a little under an hour, but the damage was extensive. 237 dead, 40 missing, 43,000 people homeless, almost 6,000 damaged buildings, and nearly 2,000 completely destroyed. This post-attack evaluation also noted that the RAF had used almost 500 explosive bombs with delayed fuses and 110,000 fire bombs. As the war ground on, the civil defense apparatus of Germany, despite the meddling from Hitler and the bureaucratic infighting at top levels, did adapt. In 1944, for example, the Luftwaffe issued a second edition of a pamphlet, more than 30 pages long, entitled "The Enemy Drops Bombs." This is an interesting artifact because it gives a lot of technical information about the introduction of these British dynamite bombs, how they've grown heavier and they're designed to go through floors, all the way to the bottom, delayed explosion, and then bring the building down. Such technical detail and such open admission of the damage these bombs are going to cause creates a morale problem. How do you convince people they can do something about it? So this pamphlet had a slogan which translates as "Everyone matters." Everyone matters. Everyone has a job to do. And also, we can do it. We will handle this. And there were many officials who were on the ground working with this information and trying to adapt. For example, the leader of one fire police service said, after these bombs were introduced, we have got to adapt. As he put it, it's better now to have a sandbag under every table than later to have a burning house. But as I said, the sheer amount of bombing overwhelmed the German civil defense operation. And here we see a Dusseldorf resident evacuating her possessions. It's interesting to note that even at this point, shops are operating normally. A shop has been hit, but you can see clothing mannequins in those carts. We don't know if this woman was compensated with stolen Jewish property, but as said, that's what the system supported. And here we see medical personnel of one of the branches of the civil defense apparatus, the Security and Aid Service, removing an injured civilian after a bombing raid in the fall of 1941. To finish, I'd like to comment on the morale effect of the bombing. As said, it did terrorize the population, but because they were dependent on the government for repairs and compensation, rations even, it didn't substantially undermine support for the Nazi regime. However, as German internal security forces themselves found, the Gestapo, many Germans began to doubt their nation's ability to win the war. And that, I think, is a significant effect on morale. What they did with that is to start to think about how they're going to protect themselves, rather than say, we need to mount a revolution. Another example we have of the way Germans processed this and how it terrified them, they referred to Allied flyers as Terrorflieger, terror flyers, people bringing us terror. And there are documented murders of downed Allied airmen who survived the crash but were killed, around 250. We do want to note that the vast majority of downed Allied airmen were taken alive to POW camps, but 250 were killed, most of them by German police who knew they were not going to be held accountable. In that sense, they're war crimes because they're carried out by officials, but there were some documented instances of civilians taking out their anger on the flyers themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Krugler. Now, finally moving on to Dr. Hadley.
So I don't actually have slides, and the reason for that, as I'll just actually explain, is rather than looking at some of the more expansive materials that my colleagues have, is I'm looking at an incident that's very specific and contained both geographically and chronologically. It's coming from me as someone not steeped in World War II, but whose primary focus is on the history of intelligence. Specifically, what I've been looking at most recently is how the legacy of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services impacts understandings of intelligence after World War II. The incident I'm looking at is something known as Operation Sunrise, which occurred between February and May of 1945 as an effort to get an early German surrender of Italian forces. Before I go any further on that, I should also just say that the views expressed by me today are my own and don't represent the official policy or position of the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the United States government, which makes me sound a lot more important than I actually am. But it is just something to make sure that I'm clear that I'm here in a personal capacity. So that Operation Sunrise is a sometimes contested thing. about how successful it actually was, how meaningful it actually was. But we'll begin the story kind of at the end, that on May 2nd, 1945, German forces in northern Italy surrendered. And that's before, 6 or 7 days before, the overall German surrender. As Dr. Citino mentioned yesterday, kind of difficult to pin down an exact date, but this Italian army, it lays down its arms, agrees to accept for most of the members of it POW status before any of the German armies that were fighting in France or on the Eastern Front. This achievement came in part on the efforts of OSS Station in Bern under the leadership of future Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles. These clandestine negotiations quickly became public after the war, and I'll at the end get into kind of why that happened at that precise time. But in September, the Saturday Evening Post reported in a story by a guy named Forrest Davis that the surrender was, quote, by no means an impromptu act. It had been preceded by 8 weeks of conversations between American intelligence authorities and defeatist Germans. Negotiations, although the Americans, bent on unconditional surrender, disliked that word, were conducted principally in neutral, spy-infested Switzerland by Major General William J. Donovan's Office of Strategic Services. End quote. So I mentioned Sunrise is somewhat contested because while people like Davis celebrated this as an achievement of American intelligence in bringing an early end to the war, critics did emerge after the war in the historical record who would argue that this scheme was more something that was reckless, driven by the ego of Dulles and by the desperate efforts of the Germans involved to avoid prosecutions for war crimes, because all of the Germans involved had committed war crimes. The critics also charge that it risked damage to and helped contribute to the deterioration of the relationship between the United States and Great Britain on the one hand as the Western Allies and the Soviet Union on the other. That these negotiations risked the agreement on unconditional surrender or even just the perception of the agreement on unconditional surrender, and thus might have caused more diplomatic problems than the actual achievement was worth. Looking back on Dulles's performance overall in neutral Switzerland, historian Max Hastings commented that Dulles really lacked skill in developing an agent network in Switzerland. Now, in part, this was kind of just because he got there later than the British, and the British had already bought up the best people that you could get for that information. But he also was more of a kind of, the gentleman scholar type coming in, the gentleman adventurer, rather than someone who is steeped in intelligence professionalism. But because he was willing to talk to a lot of different people, he was able to provide political intelligence to the United States, to the OSS back in Washington. Hastings criticizes this to an extent and says that Dulles, quote, could have functioned just effectively as had he been US ambassador, end quote. I would argue, however, that that diplomatic role is why Sunrise merits continuing attention, further attention, even kind of sidestepping the debate as to just how important this early surrender actually was. Because it represents an early example in the US experience of an organized intelligence bureaucracy playing a role outside of those that you would traditionally expect from an organization whose mission was secret intelligence and unconventional warfare. In fact, it played a diplomatic role, and that these negotiations in Sunrise exist at a nexus between intelligence and diplomacy that in many ways had been a kind of natural function of how foreign ministries or the State Department had worked prior to institutionalization of intelligence as this important and lasting bureaucratic effort. This speaks to, it's been decades now since there's a kind of initial call for intelligence history to fill in the missing dimension of diplomatic history. And a lot of work has come in to fill in that gap. But I think one of the areas that Sunrise points to as potentially worthy of further explanation or further exploration is the role of intelligence in conflict termination. So in addition to intelligence as a potential way to open channels that ward off conflict, or as a part of engaging in war, such as a massive large-scale conventional war or an irregular conflict, that intelligence also provides potential channels for turning off the conflict at a certain point. As Dr. Citino noted yesterday, there was a severe challenge in getting the Germans, who even recognized that the war was lost, to take that recognition and translate it into an actual surrender. And so in this case, Sunrise should be examined as part of that capacity of intelligence to play roles beyond those that they might necessarily have been expected. The OSS station in Bern, also with British and Swiss intelligence cooperating, became a natural place for German officers to make an approach, an open diplomatic approach, an approach to other military authorities, risked exposure. And if those were exposed, then while Adolf Hitler was still alive, those efforts would have been fairly short and likely have ended with the execution or at least imprisonment of those trying to carry them out. So looking at Sunrise as it actually happened is first I want to note that it emerges really in the particular conditions of the Mediterranean theater of operations, which had become of secondary importance to the Allies following the D-Day landings in 1944. So they siphon off men and materiel. There are obviously substantial Allied forces in Italy, but as they go north and the Italian fascist forces in the north that are the puppet government and the Nazi army under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, they manage to essentially stalemate the Allied advance. And while there's a substantial unconventional warfare efforts that the OSS and the British SOE, Special Operations Executive, attempt to carry out, these manage to keep the Germans busy, but they don't change the fundamental dynamic, that there's a very punishing, brutal slog of Italy, and then stopping in a very, kind of the dark winter of 1944 into 1945. So when in the spring of 1945, the Allies were preparing to advance in Italy again, the main fear of the Supreme Allied Commander in the theater, Field Marshal Harold Alexander, was that his forces would suffer heavy and at that point pointless losses in the face of a German last stand in the Alps. That this would become a denouement to the campaign that would just be absolutely running rivers of blood from the Allied forces and from the German ones. As historians Bradley F. Smith and Elena Agarossi note, quote, to Field Marshal Alexander and his staff, a long, bloody, senseless struggle for an Alpine redoubt seemed but a natural concluding act for an Italian campaign which had consisted of one bloody, indecisive battle after another, end quote. And so the fears of this were shared not just by the Allies, but also by neutral Switzerland, because Switzerland was concerned about a flow of refugees coming from a disrupted northern Italy, the disruption of their economic relations with northern Italy. And so the ostensibly neutral Switzerland allowed its intelligence officers to cooperate with British and American intelligence when they began receiving probes in February of 1945 from German forces that were looking for a way to surrender earlier in the conflict. These were forces that were loyal to SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff. Wolff was trying to kind of create this contact, and he finally does with Allen Dulles in later February. Dulles reports back to Washington that Wolff believes he can get German forces to surrender, quote, if the Allies can make it worth their while, end quote. Now, what I really want to distinguish here is that Dulles insists the entire time that he's not conducting negotiations, because the official US position is that there is going to be unconditional surrender. So all Dulles is doing, according to him, is receiving intelligence from Germans and transmitting it back from Washington with the support of his superior, Donovan, and with the OSS bureaucracy in Washington. But it's kind of one of those, they're saying it's not negotiations, but practically this person is saying what it would take for us to do something, and we are getting information back. Like, that's essentially a negotiation. So these efforts raised some alarms in Washington for potential diplomatic disruption. And there's also, of course, the fact that Wolff, as an SS Obergruppenführer, is not someone with exactly clean hands. He would present himself as, quote, a humane and decent and soldierly, end quote, fellow in his conduct in Italy, And to the extent that he was, that's only in comparison to other leaders within the SS. Heinrich Himmler sets a fairly low bar in terms of moral behavior. And so, Wolf might not be as bad as Heinrich Himmler, but he had conducted numerous war crimes against the civilian population in Italy during his time in charge of SS forces there. And he was also fully aware of and supportive of the Holocaust, which would eventually see him put in prison long after the war in 1962, after the Adolf Eichmann trial. Despite all that, he does appear to have been genuine in his efforts to open up this line of communication with the Allies, partly in an effort to preserve his own skin, but partly also reflecting to some extent what the Allies were afraid of, is that he was hoping that a separate peace between the Western Allies and Germany might be achieved. So the idea that there might be a provocation involved in this wasn't, an unreasonable thing for the Allies to be concerned with. There had been other efforts led by Himmler to try and throw sand in the gears of the alliance. For example, fairly recently to when these negotiations, whatever Dulles called them, began to take place, is that there had been talks in Stockholm between an OSS officer who was working with the War Refugee Board to ostensibly trade Jewish prisoners for material supplies. And then the OSS kind of alerted, based on some of their intelligence, that this was really just trying to open the door for the negotiation on a separate peace. Since Wolf claimed that Himmler didn't know what he was doing, and Donovan was able to protect Dulles bureaucratically by insisting, this is just intelligence gathering, the talks did continue. And from February to May 2nd, the fortunes of Sunrise fluctuated wildly. So it started off on a positive note of Wolf releasing several Italian partisan leaders that had been captured by German forces. And so this, taken as an initial good gesture, allows some of the talks to continue, but just conducting diplomacy in wartime northern Italy has its own complications. One meeting was called off because German officials were strafed on their way to the road to try and meet with their Allied counterparts. At one point, Wolf's family is essentially taken hostage, and he's threatened with arrest because there's a growing awareness in the Nazi apparatus that he might be trying to arrange the secret surrender. And Wolf also had overestimated his ability to convince his commanding officer, Albert Kesselring, that it was time to surrender. And when Kesselring was transferred in March and a new general came in, Heinrich von Weitinghoff, Weitinghoff is in a similar position where he personally believes it was, quote, nonsense to go on fighting, end quote. But he refused to be the first person to surrender. He, in fact, had received orders to withdraw to the Alps, what the Allies had feared, and to destroy everything that he could on the way. And he gave every indication of being willing to carry out those orders, despite the fact that he thought it was essentially nonsense to do so. Partly, this is the reaction of the physical threats and danger that were imposed by the German leadership on the German military that Dr. Citino mentioned yesterday. But it's also important to note how steeped in the myth of the stabbed in the back that the Germans were. This is the official Nazi party line, drawing on, even before the Nazis, this idea that Germans only lost in World War I because they had been treacherously stabbed in the back. No German field marshal or German general wants to be someone who acts like the civilians in 1918 and carries on that second kind of betrayal. So that's part of the dynamic that's really making anything difficult here. American and British diplomats were also correct to fear that there would be some diplomatic consequences as a result of these negotiations. The Americans and British agreed to inform the Soviets that these talks were going on, but then Prime Minister Winston Churchill, without consulting the Americans, decided to invite Soviet representatives to the talks. And the Americans were worried that this would essentially end any progress right away. It was also difficult logistically to work out at that point. And so US officials resisted having any Soviet representatives sent. So there's a very bitter exchange of diplomatic letters between the Americans and between the Soviets. Most of these are being written not by Franklin Roosevelt, who's signing them, but he's also in very bad state of health at this point. And the principal, authors on the U.S. side of this are Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Admiral William Leahy. One of the last messages sent signed by Roosevelt, is on the day of his death, the morning of April 10th, sending a message to Stalin expressing frustration at Stalin's suspicion of these efforts, but his hope that they'd kind of moved past the imbroglio. Because as a result, Dulles was ordered to cease Sunrise-related activities in April. And yet, he kept talking, and he kept saying, this is just about gathering intelligence. And even if he had wanted to stop fully, this also speaks to a kind of dynamic of things on the ground carrying on with a momentum of their own, outside of the strict control of policymakers in Washington. Whether Washington said stop, it was kind of difficult to put a hard stop on that, especially as the German officers around Wolf, they had established connections at this point with their American and British and Swiss counterparts, and so kept these lines of communication open no matter what the official kind of word coming back from Washington was, which culminates finally in some of them coming to the Allied headquarters at Caserta, with the surrender being finalized on April 29th, the day before Hitler's suicide, though with further haggling and delay until a final signature on May 1st and a promulgation on May 2nd. 13 days later, Donovan was ready to conclude that the OSS had essentially knocked down the first domino that won the war. As he said, quote, "The war in Europe has been brought to a successful conclusion much earlier than could have been otherwise possible, with the consequent saving of much lives and treasure." Now, how much this affects the overall strategic picture of things, I think it's really difficult to disentangle. A lot of things are going on in May 1945, to put it mildly, but it is an important early step in this kind of process of surrender. And at least for the men on the ground, the difference of 6 days could be really quite important if you're going to be an Allied soldier or a member of the Wehrmacht fighting for a war that is already essentially over. So whether it was worth the risks incurred remains, I think, a matter for debate. But as I said, it is an illustration of the diverse uses to which secret intelligence can be put, and also some of the complications with such employment. Got a long quote here, so stick with me, but I think it's an important one. It's from the War Report of the OSS, written by Kermit Roosevelt, and he writes that, quote, "The negotiations carried out through OSS Bern for the surrender of enemy armies in northern Italy and southern Austria had underlined one of the unique contributions an undercover and hence quasi-official agency could make in the course of modern war. With OSS personnel in Bern operating undercover, preliminary dealings could take place clandestinely without risking embarrassment to the US government. At the same time, OSS had advantages of prompt access to the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the State Department, and high military authorities in the Mediterranean theater. While the unconditional surrender formula postponed their successful conclusions until victory in the field was a certainty, OSS could gather valuable intelligence through secret negotiations and could, finally, make the cessation of hostilities at an early date." End quote. Now, the diplomatic fracas with the Soviet Union would suggest that negating risk was not a given. Anytime you've got secret negotiations going, when those become not secret, there's a risk attached there. But they demonstrate that, however imperfectly, OSS could be useful as this alternative pipeline for channels of communication that allow for at least a slightly early surrender. Now, seen in the light of the kind of nexus I'd mentioned of intelligence and diplomacy, Sunrise is an example of the early way that the bureaucratization of intelligence as its separate bureaucratic entity, separate and apart from ministries of state or departments of state, gave it some potentials as an actor that it wasn't necessarily intended to have. The OSS was set up to be in charge of secret intelligence and unconventional warfare, but it became the natural avenue of approach. And it was also recognized by the people running it that this was something that they could essentially advertise for. So this kind of coming back to the beginning now, I mentioned I'd discussed the timing of that article. The story that came out in the Saturday Evening Post about this came out in September of 1945, which is at the same time that the OSS was in the process of being dissolved. Donovan, with Dulles's help, had tried to prevent the dissolution of the OSS with a media campaign, and once that had failed, they at least tried to convince the United States that the OSS, that its legacy should live on in post-war intelligence arrangements, so that if the CIA doesn't replicate the form of the OSS, it will at least keep the spirit of the OSS. And I'll also mention that I can show verifiably that Dulles would use the Saturday Evening Post to spread positive CIA stories during his tenure as DCI. So I do think it's reasonable to speculate that he may have played a role in the Saturday Evening Post stories, especially since they were very complimentary to Allen Dulles and suggested that he deserved a medal for all of his actions. So just to kind of conclude, this whole event, the different motivations behind Dulles' motivations, not just in ending the war, but for post-war intelligence arrangements, speaks, I think, to the potential ambiguity of using intelligence as a diplomatic tool. The combination of secrecy and distance allowed Dulles and Donovan to carry out to some degree their own policy, regardless of what chief policymakers actually wanted. However, regardless of these ambiguities, the nexus of diplomacy and intelligence, I argue, merits further and continued study. And I think in particular, conflicts in the Cold War and global war on terror are likely to contain other examples, though whether at this scale I think is doubtful, but that's something that I'd say is needed further research is needed on. I think this is also a relevant story in that while we hope never again to see a conflict with the scale and destruction of World War II, as we're looking at modern conflicts in a global arena of competition, that the potential for using untraditional or unexpected lines of communication to be able to end a conflict once it has begun are likely to be of some considerable interest. And so that's where I'll conclude.
Thank you, Dr. Hadley. And with that, I will open it up to questions from the audience. Nora.
That's an excellent question. I think that's really a separate talk, so I'll try to keep it brief. But I want to correct you, all, not a majority, all Indian recruits were volunteers. The British rule in India, phrase it differently, the relationship between the British rulers of India and the nationalists was tense. But that doesn't mean that India's millions are even aware that they're being ruled by the British. That may seem strange, but Britain's own opinion pollings indicated that upwards of 70% of Indians had no idea who, in fact, ruled India. So I think the direct answer to your question is this: why volunteer for the British Army? Opportunity. During the Great Depression, you might be aware that in the Great Depression, American soldiers were regarded as gold brickers or lazy bones. In India, it was quite the opposite. If you volunteered to serve in the British military, it was an opportunity for you to make good for your family. The remits back home to your family would make you and your family celebrities in your village. And let's keep in mind that almost 85% of India is rural at this time. So poverty is a very real thing. Another thing is that Britain did a magnificent job once the war began of recruiting, and the financial incentives that they offered to soldiers were, especially Indian soldiers, were beyond the wildest dreams of what an Indian can hope for, a young Indian man could hope for if he stayed at home and not volunteered. That's the quick answer.
David?
My question is also about, I was curious, following the Civil War after Walter, what was the legacy in the following decades, and also presentation of the Second War? The Civil War that followed, or was it looked on?
I'm sorry, when you say the legacy, do you mean how does India itself regard the Second World War?
Yes.
I think that's another splendid question. I would say that Indians themselves tend to forget World War II. They like to look at the independence period and look at World War II as an interruption of this narrative of Indian independence. Rather than talk about ideas, I will tell you that I think what's important about the Indian Civil War and its legacy is this. Pakistan and India have fought 3 major wars since World War II, 2 of them over the Kashmir, but all of them relating to communalism and the conflict between ethnic communities. Generally speaking, India gets the better of Pakistan in these conflicts. But the legacy was created by the British. Remember, the British Empire was both Pakistan and India. So when India gets its independence and Pakistan gets its independence, and the 2 countries divide, the British Army, which was previously in control of 1 entity, is now in control of 2. And so you have this bizarre dividing process that occurs between 1945 and 1955, where the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, or the Royal Indian Navy, and then the Pakistani and Indian armies are scrambling to see who's going to get which British general or not, what number of Enfield rifles, artillery, tanks, so forth. And so the legacy continues into the 1960s of Britain's inability to get its act together with regard to India. And it will cause suffering in India. Again, another very short answer, very simplistic. The legacy is one of conflict, and it derives directly from World War II.
In the center here.
Oh, come on.
Sorry.
See what you spent your honorarium on.
Subhash Chandra Bose was the propaganda.
The answer is no, because he died in a plane crash. And like Elvis, many of his followers still think he's still alive. If he were still alive, the guy'd be like 140. But perhaps the more direct answer is, what happened to the members of the Indian National Army who defected and then returned back? Well, the British Army court-martialed them and found them guilty. But they were defended by Jawaharlal Nehru, Gandhi's number 2, and Nehru's argument was basically, these are patriots. There is, whether you fought with the first Sikhs in Burma or in the British 8th Army, or you fought in Malaya in the Indian National Army, you're a patriot. So the British find them guilty. Nehru defends them, and all their sentences are commuted, and India never remembers them again as anything but patriots. So Bose should not be looked at the way we look at Paten or Quisling or one of these other people. He had a long history of hating the British before World War II started.
On the brown jacket here, yeah, you, sir. Yes, yes.
Right now, I feel like I'm sure it had something to do with German bombing or with. What was the opposite? It was mostly British, and the British, the Indians were mostly NCOs or infantry. Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah, it's a good question. Part of it is, so I think Dulles recognized that he was negotiating, but I think that the argument is it is important for us to pick up what the Germans are saying. was still a pretty compelling intelligence argument. It's not a large group of people either. And so like while you have like Americans that don't stop, who might be inclined to stop, you've also got the Swiss and the British involved as well. And so you've got different signals going on. And then there's also the fact that it's not really clear to me, based on the records that exist, how much Dulles is communicating with all of his people in Italy. He's getting messages from Donovan and from Washington. I'm not sure how widely aware within the OSS station in Bern it was that they were getting like some of these directives. But that's something I'm planning on digging into further.
Dr. Campbell.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I mean, the German population understood, as well as the Weimar government and then the Nazi regime, that bombers would get through. And that's why civil defense or air defense was necessary, and that there could be effective responses through rebuilding. I did not touch upon the extensive air defense network that the Germans created. And it did inflict a lot of damage on Allied bombing. It brought a lot of planes down. To address your last question, I mean, this is a strategic blunder, again, of the Nazi regime to not develop a long-range strategic bombing force. And if you look at the decision-making process, neither Goering nor Hitler nor other top military officials see a need for it. I mean, their objectives are based on movement on the ground, with air power providing support. And the Luftwaffe was effective for a time in downing Allied aircraft. Better escort procedures on the part of the Allies blunted that. But also the effects of bombing on German industry made it impossible for the Germans to replace lost planes. And then they were short on pilots too. Thank you.
In the center in the back here.
Mm.
That's one of the things that I think are fundamental to evolving.
Yeah, I think that's the most fruitful pathway for research on this topic, and to attempt a quantification, because right now the evidence is anecdotal, based a lot on wartime accounts, letters, and post-war memories, which are fraught with the problems of memory, of course. So yeah, I have not considered doing that. This is kind of an offshoot of another project, but I think absolutely that's where there could be a real contribution to the scholarly literature on bombing in World War II, but in bombing in general, to fuse the historical approach with a sociological approach. Thank you for that.
And then we have time for one last question here.
So it really, I think, boils down to simply that by January, Wolf was like, we're not winning this. And January still, I think, fairly late in the day to be coming to that conclusion. But like really until then, one thing that I found interesting was the number of like Nazi leaders who were still convinced there would be some kind of like secret weapon that they'd be able to unleash that would change the balance of the war, or that they'd be able to peel off the Western allies from the Soviet Union. You know, that there's this prediction that Hitler keeps making that any day now, the alliance is going to fall apart just because the Soviets and the British and the Americans are just too incompatible. And as that kept failing to happen, it's by January that Wolf is looking around and saying like, well, we've lost. And he's also very well aware of the potential consequences for his actions as a member of the OSS. So I had mentioned that he eventually is arrested for war crimes. He manages to escape the first round. He's arrested, and he essentially has a mental breakdown, and he's in British, first American and then British custody until 1949. But when war trials come up for kind of second waves, Allen Dulles and other American and British intelligence officials write affidavits in his defense at a war crimes trial. And so he's ultimately found not guilty. Or actually, I should correct that, he's not charged fundamentally. And so he's able to go about and live his life until there's increased attention to the Holocaust following the Adolf Eichmann trial. So I tend to read his motivation as very self-interested, trying to kind of look out for him and his own, though he would also present his case as, I don't want more German soldiers dying than are necessary in a cause that's already been lost.
Alrighty, if you would all join me in thanking our panelists here. I think it was a very good one to start this off with.
I think probably Dulles, but
See, from your presentation, that's what I heard. But boy,
Before I read about Dulles,
don't you though? Yeah. Seriously.
It was partly British.
We'll make it work. So we have fancy new screens at the Army War College where these don't show up.
Oh, that sounds right.
They're like these. They're like this sort of glass LED sort of screens. They're not so. They're super awesome. They're like 2 stories high and they cover the whole stage, but you can't. You get like. Yeah, it's like old school. It's like, it'd be like Montgomery. Yeah. Nice to meet you. What time are we at here? Oh, we're here.
Yeah.
All right. I will be adjusting on the fly.
Yeah.
It's off right now. You haven't hit the on button. It's on flipped it in. Yeah, there's a little rubber button right there that's that on. Now it's on.
And just hold it down.
I'll try to behave. keep this short. All right. Gotta go get on a plane after this. Yeah, I'm planning to. What's that?
I didn't get one of the.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of the conference. My name's David Maloney, and I'm going to be introducing our panelists for this session. So our first panelist, closest to me, is Dr. Thomas Bruscino. He's a professor in the Department of Military Strategy, Planning, and Operations at the U.S. Army War College. He's the author of several books, including A Nation Forged in War, How World War II Taught Americans to Get Along, Developing Strategists, Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Interwar Army War College, and the American and Joint Origins of Operational Depth in the Meuse-Argonne Campaign. He's an editor and regular contributor for War Room, the online journal for the United States Army War College. Next to him is Justin Lyons. Dr. Justin Lyons is a professor of political science at Cedarville University and a former professor here at Ashland. He teaches courses on ancient and modern political thought, Winston Churchill, and ancient, medieval, and military history. In addition to numerous articles and book reviews on Winston Churchill, he is the author of Alexander the Great and Hernan Cortez, Ambiguous Legacies of Leadership. Lastly, we have Dr. Peter Campbell. He is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. He is a scholar of international relations whose research focuses on international security, civil-military relations, strategy, insurgency, and counterinsurgency, and cyber warfare, among other issues. He's the author of the book Military Realism, The Logic and Limits of Force and Innovation in the U.S. Army. We're going to be starting then with Dr. Thomas Bruscino.
All right, good morning. So yeah, I'm also, I don't speak for the Army and the Defense Department and all that stuff too, so I have to get those things out of the way, throat clearing. So if this gets out there, I'm just talking for me. Okay, this is going to be kind of an exploration of some ideas and more sort of geared towards how we sort of study history, how we study war history in particular. And so I'm going to build on, and as it turns out, so the title of this, and I have this kind of Miles' Law up here. You can look this up. We'll come back to this, where you stand depends on where you sit idea. But since, Dr. Stina's got us started yesterday, I'll continue on with this because there's actually a connection. So I already had these slides. So this is kind of cool. I go, war is merely a continuation of policy by other means. He covered this last night. We like the continuation of policy part of this. We talk about it a lot. As Americans, it makes a lot of sense to us. Politics are intimately involved in how we fight wars. But Claus's point was really by this other means, which is that we're using, and those other means are that act of force to compel our enemy to use, to do our will. This is that violence, violence and violent resistance, organized violence and violent resistance. Okay, but he also pointed out this, right? He pointed out that there's this, what he calls the Trinity that we talk about in here. And last night, or yesterday afternoon, Dr. Stino was talking about, you got these parts with violence, chance and probability, and reason. Reason is the policy part of it, sort of the objectives of the war generally, sort of in the policymakers, governments. We talked about the primordial violence, and that's the passion, often like sort of seated with the people. How into this are they? How much does it matter to them? And then there's the chance and probability part. Okay, chance and probability is interesting. This is the how we fight wars aspect. This is the military's role a lot of the times in this. And, the military broadly defined, but often the whole nation at arms. So that involves a lot of other people in it. Okay, so we have a problem with this because the way we talk about it is we use terms to try to simplify things and clarify stuff for us. We use theories, frameworks. One of those frameworks is levels of war. So we talk about tactics, how we fight battles, operational art, how we do campaigns. And then we have this thing called strategy. And really, ever since, this has been a long process, but really since World War II, strategy has increasingly grown and metamorphosized to become this kind of all-encompassing thing, right? We have this, it means kind of everything now, right? Everybody has a strategy for everything, okay? We have strategies for going to the grocery store. They probably had a strategy for this conference, hey, we're gonna send them all to a movie on Friday night so they don't get in trouble. Things like this, right? And it's just sort of this general posture that we have, and it sort of happens, out there in the ether. You can kind of see this. This is something we use to teach, and we kind of talk about this, and you kind of see all of these different, versions of it, and we have modifiers on it: grand strategy, and national security strategy, and national defense strategy, and national military strategy, and theater strategy, and strategy. We joke about this at the War College. This is an old reference, so the older people will like this. Younger people might not know this one. We joke about it. It's like putting Smurf on something. You know, so we have our, like, you know, theater Smurfy. We got theater Smurfs. We got, you know, national security Smurfs. You know, we have Smurfy leadership. You know, that strategic leadership. Like we sprinkle, or, you know, the other joke is that we just sprinkle. If we're not sure we should be talking about it at the Army War College, we just sprinkle some salt on it. But the salt is just called strategy. It's strategic. It all counts. There's a problem with this, though, and you sort of see this in people who study strategy, is that if every time somebody says they're being strategic or they're doing strategy, it starts to just mean everything. And like some people have been trying to make like a unified field theory for strategy. So like Lawrence Friedman did this, and it's like, so it ends up being this really, really generic statement of, you know, any kind of like future looking planned, you know, policy approach to stuff. And it gets very, you know, if it means everything, it kind of means nothing, is the point of this, right? And like even internal to war, which is where strategy came out of, as Dr. Stino pointed out, you know, it comes out of this word strategos. It basically means generalship, you know, things that generals or admirals do. Like that was the kind of point of it in its origins. But now it's gone all over the place and become something else. Okay, so here's the problem with this, even internal to wars. If everybody's doing strategy, if every decision that's around is around you know, issues in a war is strategy, then what happens is we tend to treat that like every time a decision made, it's sort of like everybody has a role in the decision is competing over this strategy, right? So like they're having some sort of competition about this, and then we see our roles as students of war. When we're looking at these set of decisions that are made in war, and I'm going to try not to use strategy very much in this because of this confusion. We're going to talk a little about something different, but we tend to see it as competitive. You know, who made an argument in something and then they won. You know, it was they got this. You know, they were the winner of this, and then so we say as historians, and so we have, you know, students of war will often be like, yeah, like so and so won that debate, and that's not really how it works. Okay? And this is a problem. It's causing us to not really understand war. So and really. Decision-making in war, and I can't like emphasize this enough, is a collective effort based on a variety of perspectives from necessarily different positions or echelons of responsibility. Okay, I'm gonna try to explain this. Okay, so let's talk about the World War II in the Pacific to kind of get at this and to understand this. And I'm gonna like keep this actually fairly simple, but it's gonna be so. But bear with me because it's gonna seem kind of complicated at first. There's theater commanders. Right, and we basically said there's like two broad theaters in the Pacific. It's, you know, Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific area. You know, from their perspective, their responsibility, their echelon of responsibility is for that theater, and they have command authority in that theater, and then they have sort of advisory roles, especially in relationship to each other and up to their higher command. Right, so that's like they both have similar things. We also invent something called the Joint Chiefs of Staff in World War II. Right, so this is the senior chiefs of all of the services, right? Collectively, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in World War II adopt some decision-making authority or granted it by the president, especially though for decision-making in the Pacific War. They're in charge of the Pacific War, the overall decision-making in the Pacific War, okay? They also have advisory responsibilities when it comes to the global war, right? Individually though, the Chief of Naval Operations, so Admiral Ernest King, he has decision-making authority related to the manning, training, and equipping of the Navy. Okay, so he's the guy who's in charge of like the stuff we're gonna build up in the Navy, the people we're gonna put into it, how we're gonna train them, all of that. And he has a voice on the Joint Chiefs of Staff for decision-making and advising. He's got a voice. He's one of the contributors to it. Chief of Staff of the Army, George C. Marshall, has a similar role for the Army: man, train, and equip the Army, especially the ground forces, through a subordinates that he has. In the Army Service Forces, Army Ground Forces, and then another voice in the decision-making that the Joint Chiefs of Staff do. Interestingly, the de facto chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's actually the Chief of Staff, military Chief of Staff to President Roosevelt, is Admiral William Leahy, right? He doesn't have any decision-making authority. And that's actually the case with the chairman now of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's still the same case. He's also an advisor. He has a voice in their decisions, and he serves mainly as a conduit between President Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs, you know, when they don't have their individual meetings there. Even more interestingly, the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Force, it's the Army Air Force, basically is given by Marshall the authority to do the man training and equipping for the Air Force, which is a role he takes very seriously and gets after it. He has a voice on the Joint Chiefs as an advisor. And then even more interestingly, he is also becomes the commander of the 20th Air Force, which is the strategic bombing force in the Pacific War. And he has command of that, which is kind of fascinating. Of course, President Roosevelt and President Truman, as commander-in-chief, have ultimate decision-making authority on all of these issues, but they often delegate those to lower levels. There's certain things that they do, and there's certain ones they stick into, and there's ones that they stay out of. Okay, so the way to understand this is that each of these echelons, and there's plenty more, right? There's a whole bunch of other ones that are involved, and lots of voices in this, civilians and Henry Stimson, you can name all of Secretaries of War, Secretary of Navy. Each of these echelons had sort of vast and often unique associated responsibilities. They spent the majority time on those responsibilities, right? That's the perspective they argued from. So what we're understanding is in the strategic discussions, in the discussions about decisions they're going to make about the war, about how they're going to fight the war, they're where they stood on issues depended on where they sat, right? This is this point, and that's a good thing. We have to understand it this way. That's a good thing. It allows for all kinds of creativity, and it's super useful. So this brings us to the Pacific War. Okay, let's bring us to the Pacific War. And there's some of the big issues with this. And we'll start with the Germany First issue. The Germany First issue is actually a presidential decision that's made prior to U.S. entry into the war. There's a whole bunch of studies. It's kind of done by a proto Joint Chiefs of Staff advice that goes to Roosevelt, and he decides on this before the war, along with Churchill. All because from the perspectives they had at the time, it made a whole lot of sense. Say, hey, it's really important that we keep Great Britain in the war, even though they had a lot of emphasis on the Pacific, both Army and Navy. We forget this. We're overwhelmingly focused on the Pacific and the Japan problem. They all agreed before, hey, we need to keep Great Britain in the war. There's the discussions we had earlier, and their empire, obviously, as you heard earlier. And that Germany is the greater, more immediate and more permanent threat. But this view becomes really kaleidoscopic right after December 7th, 1941. Right, so let's talk about their different seats. Where you sit or where you stand depends on where you sit. If you're Nimitz, I don't care about the global war. I care about my theater. So I'm going to provide all kinds of how can I win in my theater? I've been given this area of responsibility. How can I win in my theater? That's what I'm focused on. That's my advice. MacArthur, same thing. How do I win in my theater? How do I defeat this enemy in my theater? Right. Sort of interestingly, we often sort of say the change well, I'll come back to that. Ernest King, who's responsible for the overall Navy, right, as Chief of Naval Operations, he looks at this and says, hey, the Navy that I'm building, most of the assets that are in the Navy I'm building don't even work for the Atlantic War. So I'm going to I want to focus this stuff on the Pacific side. So that's his perspective. That's where the fight is from the Navy perspective, right? George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, he sticks with Germany first and Germany fast. Right, as direct as possible. Let's get after them, and that's the position he argues from primarily. Although he comes off of that. Hap Arnold, right, the Air Force Chief of Staff. His view is, I don't really care which theater we go to. I just want to go to whichever one I can use strategic bombers on and win the war. Prove that I can win the war. We can win the war through strategic bombing. Right? The reason they call it strategic is because they mean it as war winning, decisive. Right, so that's his view on it. Right. We all know that the Germany first choice doesn't play out that way, right? It ends up being much more of a balanced fight between the two sides of the globe in the fight, right? And we generally we often chalk this up to Ernest King, arguing and maybe even insubordinately pushing stuff to the Pacific, and this allows the Pacific War to be more balanced and to get kicked off faster than the intent was. Beat Germany first, defend against Japan at first, but as it turns out, if you look from each of their perspectives, what really happened is they collectively found that as they developed, as they looked at the different problems and they developed resources, a lot of them were better fitted to the Pacific War, and they wouldn't diminish the European War, given how the European War was developing in 1942 and 43. Going to Africa instead of trying to go straight to the continent, that changes things. Right, so that allows they have some different it becomes a collective decision. This sets the stage for the rest of the war and all the big issues. So included in these would be things I know this is hard to see, how this kind of question of so there's a long time critique that having the two theaters between Nimitz and MacArthur was this mistake. It broke up unity of command. Interestingly, it's like Douglas MacArthur who mostly argues this because Douglas MacArthur, and he wants to be in charge of everything. But you know, we critique him for that everywhere else. But here we go, yeah, you know, he's got a point. I'm not so sure when you look at this from, like, when you look at it from the different echelons of responsibility and the kind of bargaining and the convergence of ideas that come together when you look at the problem from all these different echelons or positions of responsibility, right? So, like, so to start with this, like, let's keep in mind that, like, if you start at the top with Roosevelt, you know, what's his major? How does he think that, like, is the most important thing in the Pacific War? China. We always forget this. He thinks the most important thing is China. You know, he says, you know, I want, like, China and the post-war world to be, you know, on our side. You know, think about all of the efforts he goes through throughout the war to bring Chiang Kai-shek into all the diplomatic stuff. I mean, they're on the UN Security Council for this reason, because he's so concerned with this throughout the fight. Militarily, they look at that and they look at it and go, yeah, sure, absolutely. China's the place to go. Like, that's the place where we want to fight them from. It's, you know, proximity, it's great, it's close. Hap Arnold, the Air Force guy, is like, yeah, absolutely, man, put bombers there. That's the place we want to be. This is the whole, one of the points of the Doolittle raid, is to turn those bombers around and start using them back on Japan again, right? So this is the idea of it. Like, he's like, yeah, let's all do this. The rest of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and everybody else is like, yeah, that's great. We can't get there. We can't get there. We can't sustain the flight. There's no way to actually get there to China. It's closed off. You have to go over the Himalayas. The Japanese and the operations they talked about at the beginning of the war in the previous panel close it all off. So it's a massive problem, right? So then, you know, so then they kind of look at it again and you say, okay, well, how do we get to Japan, keeping in mind all these different perspectives? Again, this is kind of hard to see, I guess, on this, but you know, one of the things that's really important to understand is, like, why do we end up with these two approaches? And you see them, the sort of the two approaches that are in there, and how the sort of war breaks out and starts to happen is like that. We kind of forget this. We think, like, Guadalcanal is a cool story, the Marines fight there, but, like, you have to really understand what Guadalcanal is. You know, when the Japanese are attacked and they get into the Solomon Islands, you know, this is the key to everything in the war against the United States. It's key to everything because it sits along the path of the line of communications to Australia, one of our major allies, and bases for this war that's happening here. It also, and this is the more important part, it sits here where you can't do this central attack or this more land-based attack if the Japanese control here, because they're on the flank of either of those attacks. So you start to see the sort of convergence of a fight there, and then they kind of break apart, and then they begin these two approaches. And you see, like, what happens is, you know, it was necessary to have separate types of fights. The geography and the nature of the enemy makes this happen. The Japanese are in all of these places. This is what this red line indicates, right? You know, most people don't realize this. New Guinea is the second largest island in the world, behind Greenland. Luzon is like 15th or something. Like, these are massive, massive land fights. You're going to need ground forces in this thing. It's going to be it's going to be a joint but land-heavy campaign. Now, during the Pacific, you know, this is big, wide open spaces, small islands. This is going to be a primarily maritime, naval-led fight with, like, still joint. It's going to require some ground forces, but it's going to, you know, that's the way it's going to be. They're different fights, but they're mutually supporting, right? And this is what happens in this fight. They start to realize, you know, they don't have a choice. They don't have a choice. They can't choose between either one of these. In order to take the Gilberts and Marshalls, you have to protect this flank. You have to take the Solomons and the Bismarck Archipelago, right? In order to take New Guinea, you have to take the Carolines and the Marianas, right? In order to take the Philippines, you have to take Palau, and vice versa. And they know this. Right, that's the problem. The Japanese have plenty of forces that would be attacking these open flanks, so they have to do this. Right, so this is the way that it starts to develop over time, right? And then it gets more interesting on this too, because it's not just those two theaters. We forget this. There's actually some other kind of theater type level commands there, including the submarine fleet, which does incredible damage to the Japanese. It sinks the most Japanese ships by a large measure, especially if you combine merchant and naval vessels. It's a submarine effort, and so that's kind of coming out of the Pacific Fleet, but, like, largely independent, kind of doing their own thing under Admiral Charles Lockwood, who we often forget about. And then I mentioned that Arnold comes in and he says, like, there's another campaign in this. You know, once we get in the range, I'm going to use my responsibilities as the Army Air Force to build B-29s, long-range bombers, and once I have those, you get me close enough, and I'll start, I'll have an independent campaign. It's going to cross all these other theater boundaries. So it's going to be my own independent campaign. And all of these things are playing together, right? And we see this play out, for example, in this debate about the supposed fireworks about Luzon versus Formosa. Remember, like, I'm talking about, so like when they're doing this campaign, these guys are oriented towards going towards Formosa. MacArthur's going towards the Philippines. And we often boil this down. This is the perfect example of MacArthur wins the debate. He says, well, we're going to put them on, like, we're going to go to Luzon, right? We're going to, like, and because because we owe it to the Philippines and its personality. It's not at all what happens. It's not really at all what happens. By the time they make the decision in the fall of 1944 for this, here's what it is, right? The hoped for Roosevelt-Arnold China approach to Japan is long gone, right? It's not going to work in China. We can't, the Chiang Kai-shek can't get off his feet. Stilwell can't get him moving. Stilwell's about to get fired, actually, on this. Like, it's a whole problem there, right? From the King Navy and like Nimitz theater perspective, the attack on Formosa would have no support from the mainland, which they needed. And in fact, they'd probably be opposed by Japanese forces. So why would we do that? It doesn't make that much sense. So it's an extremely difficult problem. Arnold doesn't care. He doesn't need, the airfields would be hard to take on northern Taiwan, then is now. Like, it's a very difficult place to fight, so it'd be hard to take there. And he's like, it doesn't matter. We have the Marianas, and I can range Japan anyway. I don't need it, right? So from his perspective. Where else we had from the sort of Admiral King and the Admiral Leahy perspective, where we can win the war by blockading Japan, by starving them to death. Philippines works just as well as Formosa for having sub bases, which they put into the Philippines to help cut off all the Japanese shipping and destroy all the merchant shipping into Japan. It works just as well, so it doesn't matter, right? From the Marshall perspective, George C. Marshall perspective of driving towards a land invasion of Japan, which is what he thinks is going to be necessary to win the war, Luzon worked just as well as Formosa for further advances. And that's before we get to MacArthur's point. They had all determined that independently from their perspective, and then they come to the decision. And it's worth remembering that when they come to this decision, like, they literally, like, this is not a Luzon versus Formosa decision. This is Luzon and Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the bombing and the sub attacks. Okay? It's all of those things together, all come together. And it's literally in the order, which I won't like read to you the whole thing, but you get if you read through this order, it's literally this stripped down little order covers all of that stuff right in there. Directions to MacArthur, Nimitz, support each other in these two fights. You're going to do, here's your missions. Arnold for his bombing campaign with the 20th Air Force. The submarine stuff sort of buried in the kind of orders for it. Hey, Stilwell, help if you can, but you can't. We know that, right? So like, it's all in this thing. So it is for Luzon and Formosa. So it is for the end of the war, for the invasion, right? And so like, and the debates, like we get into this whole like debate about whether the whether the bombardment would have won, whether the blockade would have won, and they all hold these different positions, or whether it was necessary to invade. As it happens, the atomic bombs sort of end the debates for it. But the real point of this is it didn't matter to them. If the blockade won, they all win. If the bombardment wins, they all win. If it required the invasion, they all win. And all of those things would have been mutually supporting. All of those things would have helped the other things. Right? We see how this like all kind of comes together. It's not a food fight among each other. It's all, so like where you sit, like it depends where you stand on this. But they all sat facing the same direction, which is always like important to remember about this. So as historians, what I would say is don't be slave to levels of war, pick apart strategy. Understand and describe specific echelons or positions of responsibility. Be aware of the biases associated with taking any of those seats. Be careful as a student about adopting and becoming an apologist for those biases, which often happens. Leahy was the best. You guys writing about that recently. But be just as careful about critiquing the biases for those who hold those positions, right? Because they're based on their perspective. Only then can we really like more accurately describe how and why they came to individual and collective decisions. And only then can we really analyze and evaluate those decisions, right? So like describe first, then try to figure out what happened. And then only then will we really sort of better understand how wars are fought and won. Thank
you. The next panelist will be Dr. Justin Lyons.
No, I've been. Thank you. It's unlike Woodrow Wilson, I'm not hiding my true first name of Thomas. All right. First, I need to ask your chronological indulgence a little bit, because I'm going to begin a bit earlier than the theme of the conference might suggest. And I think that's necessary to fully understand the dysfunctional relationship between Churchill and the Soviets. Churchill's first significant involvement with Russia occurred during the concluding stages of the First World War. The Minister of Munitions, 1917 to 1919, and Secretary of State for War, 1919 to 1921, he witnessed the agonies of a desperate nation and the torments of its transition to a new political identity. In Volume 4 of his World Crisis, his disapproval of this new identity is fully evident in his account of its beginnings. While Russia was already in disarray after the abdication of the Tsar, Churchill relates that Bolshevism was unleashed by the Germans as a biopolitical weapon, writing, "They transported Lenin in a sealed truck like a plague bacillus from Switzerland into Russia. When the disease had run its course, something altogether malignant emerged." Churchill writes, "An apparition with countenance different from any yet seen on earth stood in place of the old ally. We saw a state without a nation, an army without a country, a religion without a god." The Soviet government, of course, suspended hostilities in March of 1918, making peace with Germany and withdrawing from the war. And even when peace was at last secured, Russia would take no part in the peace conference at Paris. It had withdrawn into malevolent isolation, shutting itself off from the family of nations and the progress of civilization. Now, there were many within Russia who opposed the Bolsheviks, and Churchill was in favor of helping them. His tenacious advocacy of their cause was a driving factor in developing the warmonger label he would encounter throughout his career. The issue fell under his official purview as Secretary of State for War. As such, he shouldered the great task of the demobilization of British forces, which confronted the question of Britain's commitments in Russia. Because one of their aims was to maintain Russia's belligerent status in the war, the Allies pledged to assist the white opposition to the newly installed communist government. Even after the armistice had removed the necessity of a reestablished Eastern Front, the prospects of German dominance of a war-ravaged Russia and the spread of Bolshevist doctrines argued for continued presence. Churchill argued that not only was it prudent to maintain a role in Russian affairs, but that Britain had an obligation of honor to the anti-Bolshevik forces to whom she had pledged continued support, saying, "There are still Russian armies in the field under Admiral Kolchak and General Denikin who have never wavered in their faith and loyalty to the Allied cause, and who are fighting valiantly and by no means unsuccessfully against that foul combination of criminality and animalism which constitutes the Bolshevist regime." Churchill did not pull punches, generally speaking. Beyond the obligations of honor, Churchill stressed that Britain also had obligations of principle, saying, "The British nation is the foe of tyranny in every form. That is why we fought Kaiserism. That's why we would fight it again. That is why we are opposing Bolshevism. Of all tyrannies in history, the Bolshevist tyranny is the worst, the most destructive, and the most degrading. It's sheer humbug to pretend that it's not far worse than German militarism." In other words, the war against the Kaiser was over, the struggle against tyranny was not. Churchill's speeches and memoranda are replete with hard language concerning Bolshevism throughout this period, causing many to think he had become unbalanced on the matter, to the point of courting another war, a prospect the war-weary nation could not, in the end, bear to contemplate, and which Bolshevik sympathizers in Britain thought positively wicked. He became so associated with action in Russia that he'd often remind his critics that the situation was not of his making, but he left little doubt what he would do about it if he could, now that Britain was involved. But British policy concerning involvement in the ongoing Russian Civil War remained unclear. Prime Minister David Lloyd George was reluctant to make further commitments, and a definite policy was lacking. His opposition to intervention increasingly clashed with Churchill's strongly expressed opinions. Churchill presented reports and pressed for support of the Whites to the point the Prime Minister charged that his single-minded obsession with Russia was distracting him from attending to his other duties. Part of the difficulty was that the British policy was bound up with those of its allies, particularly the United States. At Lloyd George's suggestion, Churchill traveled to Versailles, seeking authoritative instructions and a clear policy. In the world crisis, Churchill describes his only personal contact with President Wilson, who was about to return to the United States, during which he pressed for a decision on Russia. As Wilson had made his non-interventionist and diplomatic preferences clear, Churchill did not expect much support. In Churchill's description, Wilson was affable but unhelpful, offering little more than the truism that there were the gravest objections to every course, yet some course must be taken sooner or later. With Wilson now absent, Churchill tried to rally support among the other Allied leaders for intervention in Russia. He proposed an Allied Council for Russian Affairs, which would include a military section. But the tide of opinion was now flowing decisively against him. Allied policy remained muddled for some time to come, but it was clear that Churchill would not win the day. In the event, of course, Churchill moved from the War Office to the Colonial Office, where his restless energies would be directed toward the complexities of the Middle East and Ireland. In the period between the two world wars, Churchill did not have much contact with Russia, but his opposition to the ideology of the Bolshevism continued unabated, and he used the opportunities that came to him to denounce it. My favorite of which is a speech that he delivered in November of 1928, entitled Communism and Cancer, which ended with, he's talking about remedies about which there's great difference of opinion. Some say the knife, but all are agreed the remedies should be prompt and drastic. With the coming of the Second World War, however, Churchill's prime minister would have to face the question of suppressing political differences with the Soviets. In August of '39, Germany and the Soviet Union, of course, signed a non-aggression agreement, which seemed a marriage of convenience rather than a love match. Hitler secured his eastern flank in preparation for the move west. Russia gobbled up the crumbs that fell from the table that Germany had set. Churchill had no love for either party, viewing them as equally hostile to the principles and practices of political liberty. When Hitler failed to crush British resistance, he broke the pact and invaded Russia in 1941. What would Churchill's policy be? He immediately made the answer very clear in a broadcast that same day, calling Hitler a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder, who, not content with terrorizing Europe, must now carry his work of butchery and desolation among the vast multitudes of Russia and of Asia. Churchill did not pretend Russia was an innocent victim, nor did he disavow past criticism. But the necessity of destroying Hitler's regime outweighed other considerations. The Soviets were the lesser of two evils. Churchill said that the Nazi regime is indistinguishable from the worst features of communism. It is devoid of all theme and principle except appetite and racial domination. Excels all form of human wickedness in the efficiency and cruelty of its ferocious aggression. No one has been a more consistent opponent of communism than I have for the last 25 years. I will unsay no word that I've spoken about it. But all this fades away before the spectacle which is now unfolding. The past, with its crimes, its follies, and its tragedies, flashes away. Any man or state who fights on against Nazism will have our aid. Any man or state who marches against Hitler, with Hitler, is our foe. Churchill's attitude is perhaps best summed up by his famous remark, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." Establishing good relations with Russia and Premier Stalin was an arduous process. The Soviet Union was to be a demanding ally. Stalin pressed continually for military supplies, airplanes, tanks, trucks, guns, and other materials such as aluminum and rubber in vast quantities. Though Britain had little to spare, Churchill thought it was important to try to meet these demands. First, because he feared Russia would fall to the Germans, and later because they were holding 200 German divisions on the Eastern Front that could not be used in the West. Accordingly, convoys to Archangel began, a grueling, costly, and dangerous undertaking for which Churchill thought Stalin failed to show any reasonable gratitude. Stalin's second demand was the opening of a second front to relieve the pressure of German forces on Russia. This demand Churchill also desired to fulfill, but the Americans were still mobilizing, Britain lacked the strength, and no joint policy had been agreed upon. Churchill's preference was for personal diplomacy when possible, and he was to travel extensively in the war years in pursuit of it. In August of 1942, he flew to Moscow to meet with Stalin, recording, "I pondered on my mission to this sullen, sinister Bolshevik state I had once tried so hard to strangle at its birth. What was it my duty to say to them now?" Some of what he had to say he knew they would not like. There would be no second front in 1942. It was like carrying a large lump of ice to the North Pole, he said. Still, I was sure it was my duty to tell them the facts personally and have it all out face to face with Stalin rather than trust to telegrams and intermediaries. Churchill did, of course, have some palliatives that he could offer. The continuing Arctic convoys, the expanding bombing offensive meant to cripple Germany's industry and infrastructure, and forthcoming Anglo-American operations. Churchill argued that a second front need not mean only attacking the fortified coast opposite England. Its purposes could be partially accomplished by opening a new front in the Mediterranean. British forces were already fighting Rommel in Libya and Egypt, and America would soon launch Operation Torch to drive the Germans out of North Africa. Stalin was pleased, though not satisfied with these plans. Though by no means without tension, Churchill's visit had begun to melt the ice. By the time of Churchill's second face-to-face meeting with Stalin, the operations in North Africa had succeeded. Sicily had been secured, and British and American troops were battling their way up the Italian peninsula. Stalin also had his successes to boast. The German Sixth Army had surrendered to Stalingrad in 1942, and their offensive in 1943 halted at Kursk. The tide had turned on the Eastern Front. The Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met at Tehran in November of 1943 to discuss military options for the following year. First on Stalin's agenda was, again, a European second front. Having little patience for indirect action, he minimized the importance of ongoing Mediterranean operations, arguing that the resources being expended in Italy should be redirected to Western Europe, and showing little interest in a campaign dear to Churchill's heart to gain Turkey in order to dominate the Black Sea. Launching Overlord in Europe was his constant theme. The conference frustrated Churchill because Stalin's bluntly stated positions were closer to those of the American military planners than to his own. In addition, it was becoming increasingly clear that the partnership Churchill did so much to nurture with America was an unequal alliance. The advantages of the United States and resources, productive capacity, and sheer numbers of troops were only amplified by differing strategic aims and opinions. Those differences would be played out in front of the Russians at Tehran. Churchill's discomfort was increased by Roosevelt's approach to cultivating a relationship with Stalin at Churchill's expense. Though his account in the Second World War is restrained, it is apparent that he was stung by Roosevelt's tactics. Roosevelt was determined to melt ice of his own with Stalin and had only limited time to do so. He achieved some success by poking fun at Churchill in Stalin's presence. Stalin was delighted not so much by the jokes as by the indications of disunity between the two capitalist allies. Seizing the moment, Roosevelt dubbed him Uncle Joe. Churchill was concerned by increasing indications that he was becoming the odd man out. Writing in Closing the Ring, the fact the president was in private contact with Marshal Stalin and dwelling at the Soviet embassy and that he had avoided ever seeing me alone since we left Cairo, in spite of our hitherto intimate relations, and the way in which our vital affairs were interwoven led me to seek a direct personal interview with Stalin. Churchill's aim was to correct misconceptions about British views he feared were forming in Stalin's mind, particularly that Churchill was opposed to overlord, and to explain his strategic reasoning about the complications of the American presence. Stalin listened, but did not change his views. Other matters were discussed in General Council, such as the post-war division of Germany, the boundaries of Poland, and how to deal with Finland, both during and after the war. These discussions yielded no concrete agreements. In his later account, Churchill proclaimed himself content with the military aspects of the conference. But he could hardly have been pleased by the growing realization that in a world increasingly dominated by the Russian and American titans, Britain's geopolitical influence was in decline. Churchill made a second journey to Moscow in October 1944. Victory in the West now seemed within the Allies' grasp, and Churchill was increasingly concerned that the arrangements concerning borders and spheres of influence be agreed upon with the Soviets while the war was still ongoing. His concerns were amplified by his opinion the United States were, quote, very slow in realizing the upsurge of communist influence, which slid on before as well as followed the onward march of the mighty armies directed from the Kremlin, end quote. The Moscow visit was an attempt to reach an outline agreement on Poland, Greece, and the Balkans, but he faced a difficult task. Stalin seemed intent on getting all that he could from the war. Churchill had then to balance military and geopolitical realities against his opposition to the spread of communism. Churchill felt responsibility for Poland, whose government had taken refuge in London, and the issue of Poland's post-war borders had been raised at Tehran, and Churchill did so again in Moscow, orchestrating a meeting between representatives of Poland's government in exile and the Soviet-backed Lublin Polish Committee. Given the unwillingness of either side to compromise, these talks were not very fruitful. Dark clouds of foreboding hung over Poland. In pursuit of a viable understanding regarding the Balkans, Churchill produced a proposal which he called the Naughty Document, assigning percentages of interest and influence in Romania, Greece, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Stalin was non-committal. By the time the Big Three met again at the Yalta Conference in February of '45, military issues had become secondary to political questions. Germany's Ardennes offensive had been soundly defeated, and the Red Army was only 40 miles from Berlin. The time had come for serious discussion about the shape of the post-war world. The futures of Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Iran, and China had to be considered, along with the partition of Germany, Russia's entry into the war against Japan, and the founding of the United Nations organization. In his account, Churchill calls Poland the most urgent reason for the Yalta Conference. The future of Poland had already been the subject of extensive correspondence between the three leaders, and Churchill hoped that an agreement could be reached in person. But the divergences between the Allies were widening with the approaching defeat of Germany, and the fate of Poland was, Churchill says, to prove the first of the great causes which led to the breakdown of the Grand Alliance. FDR was by this point very frail and ill, and in any case, had different priorities, ranking Russia's promise to enter the war in the Pacific and the founding of the UNO above Poland. As a result, Churchill received only lukewarm support from Roosevelt in arguing the issue with Stalin. Churchill was less concerned with territorial questions than he was with the democratic character of the new Polish government, arguing strenuously for free and fair elections. His cause was not aided by the Red Army's physical possession of Poland, nor by Roosevelt's announcement of his, in Churchill's view, precipitous departure. Stalin made promises about free elections in Poland, and Churchill could do little but accept them. In truth, nothing short of war could have saved Polish democracy or pried Poland from Stalin's grasp. So how was Churchill feeling at Yalta? We have this picture up here. For the body language experts in the room, the position of the hat says it all. That was a joke. In case that didn't come over. The final act of the war, drama, in which Churchill and Stalin were both players, was the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. Roosevelt had died in April, and Churchill had since been cultivating a relationship with his successor, Harry Truman, whom he found capable and friendly. Germany was defeated, Hitler was dead, Japan alone remained the military challenge facing the Allies. But there were other challenges that never passed from Churchill's mind in shaping a post-war world as far as possible in conformity with Anglo-American political values. In the months leading up to the conference, Churchill had repeatedly urged the Americans to advance as far as possible to limit the range of Soviet control. Cabling Eisenhower, I deem it highly important that we should shake hands with the Russians as far east as possible. But the Americans had different views. Frustrated about the European situation, Churchill had astonished his chiefs of staff in May by asking them to draw up plans for an Anglo-American operation to drive the Red Army back. But it was impossible, and so diplomatically scandalous that documentation of the project was not released by the National Archive until 1998. Stalin was in unassailable possession of Eastern Europe, and his policy was correspondingly rigid. He knew that the Western Allies would not and could not do anything about it. He was very friendly to Churchill at Potsdam because it would cost him nothing. Wrangle how he would about Poland and the rebuilding of Europe, the British leader's power to shape events was exhausted. Before Potsdam was concluded, the Conservative Party lost the general election, and he was officially relieved of the task altogether.
Our third and final panelist will then be Dr. Peter Campbell.
Morning, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. There we go. All right, thanks for the invitation to come and talk about my research and the role that the end of World War II plays in that. So America will celebrate its 250th birthday this summer. As nations go, it is comparatively young. Yet often we think of the pivotal points of American history, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the First and Second World Wars, as being separated by great gulfs of time. A look at the historical record quickly removes this misconception. For instance, while the American Civil War and the First World War seem remote from one another, the battlefield tactics developed in the Civil War informed, for better or worse, the tactics of the First World War. We can also see the individuals who participated in these conflicts as remote from one another in time, and especially in the insular American context, as remote from the history of Europe. This too is an illusion. For instance, the commander of Union forces in the American Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, traveled the world at the conclusion of his second presidential term. On one of those stops, he met with Otto von Bismarck, the author of German Unification and master of the great power politics of Europe. Together, the two statesmen pored over maps of the battlefields of the American Civil War, and Grant explained his strategic reasoning surrounding the campaign to end the war. Bismarck would famously quip, "God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America." The same illusion of historical remoteness must be swept away with regard to my subject for today, Dwight David Eisenhower and the Second World War. Eisenhower was born a mere 25 years after the end of the American Civil War. As he notes in At Ease, Stories I Tell My Friends, barbers, bakers, doctors, and lawyers who practiced in the sleepy town of Abilene, Kansas, where I grew up, were veterans of the battles of the American Civil War. When the people of Abilene spoke of the war during Ike's childhood, they were referring to the contest between the North and the South that had shaped and reshaped their communities and their collective memory. The links to the Civil War would stretch from Eisenhower's childhood across 2 world wars and 2 presidential terms and conclude with his retirement to a farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, site of the most important battle of the Civil War. Unlike the average American today, sadly, Eisenhower had a deep sense of history. His life was shot through with its study. As a boy, his mother would have to lock away his editions of Plutarch and other ancient writers so that young Ike would do his chores. Imagine that today. He would lose himself in the stories of ancient politics and war and neglect his other responsibilities. Little did Eisenhower know at the time that he himself would play a pivotal role in the greatest and most terrible military conflict ever, one in which the casualties of the battles of Marathon and Salamis, 7,000 and 24,000 respectively, would look insignificant in comparison. The Battle of the Bulge alone, as we learned yesterday, resulted in almost 200,001 casualties on both sides. It is estimated that 1.2 million and 1 people lost their lives in and around Stalingrad. In that terrible conflict, Eisenhower would become Supreme Allied Commander and lead the largest military force ever assembled by the United States. He would marshal those forces and those of the Allies to utterly destroy the military machine that had seen its genesis under Bismarck, crushing a German militarism whose will had not been crushed by the end of the First World War. Indeed, General Pershing and his subordinate, General Fox Connor, who would become the salvager of Ike's Army career and his intellectual mentor, opposed an armistice in 1918 because the will of the German state and people had not been sufficiently broken to guarantee a lasting peace. They echoed Grant's thinking regarding the necessity of a final decisive campaign at the end of the Civil War. The 2 sides in the Civil War were at a standoff, Grant argued in his memoir. The 2 armies had been confronting each other so long, Grant explained, without any decisive result, that they hardly knew which could whip. The Confederates had not been convinced by the force of arms that they had been defeated, and no cessation of hostilities would produce a lasting peace unless they were so convinced. For Eisenhower and a number of his contemporaries then, the Second World War was made necessary because of the indecisive nature of the end of the First. The decisive nature of the end of the Second World War helped ensure that a third would not be necessary. I should note that I am not a historian, but a political scientist by training. There's much disagreement about the nature of the difference between these 2 disciplines. Political scientists have a predilection for the development of testing abstract theories that seek to explain rather than describe historical events. At present, my research focuses chiefly on soldier statesmen, military leaders who rise to high command and subsequently become head of state. Specifically, I'm concerned with how their military experience impacted their foreign policy, especially when it comes to crises where force was contemplated or used. Eisenhower is one of the 3 generals turned president that are the subject of my current book. Entitled Soldier Statesman, the book examines the effects of supreme military command on the foreign policy approaches of Presidents Washington, Grant, and Eisenhower. The book argues that all 3 were imbued with what I call a military realist worldview that was a result of their military experience. I argue that this military realist mindset emerges from the underlying logic of force and the friction and uncertainty that always accompany the use of force in all historical periods. The military realist worldview has 2 related components. The first component is a deep appreciation for the uncertainty generated by the use of force. The use of force in war is rife with uncertainty because it always involves a reactive adversary. Using violence to impose your will on the unwilling initiates a dynamic interaction only partly under your control. As Clausewitz notes, I am not in control. My enemy dictates to me as much as I dictate to him. In war, we can devise brilliant plans, but we cannot simply impose those plans on our adversary. Their actions and reactions can compel us to change or abandon our plans. As von Moltke the Elder noted, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Or as Mike Tyson very eloquently put, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. In the military parlance of today, the enemy gets a vote. Your enemy is not passive. How your enemy responds to your plan will impact it in unforeseen ways. The interactive nature of war makes it inherently unpredictable. As Clausewitz said, war is the realm of uncertainty, and its course can never be predicted in advance. The effects of escalation by one side in war nicely demonstrates the uncertainty built into the violent interaction. In a contest to be decided by force alone, each party to a violent interaction must equal or surpass its opponent's escalation to impose its will on the unwilling by force. Whether in a tactical engagement or a war, if reciprocal escalation is impossible or undesirable, the incapable or unwilling party must change or relinquish the object it seeks by force. The military realist knows that war's interactive violence tends to escalate as each side attempts to achieve its goal by overcoming the resistance of the opposition through incremental increases in force. A decision by an opponent to escalate their use of force confronts the other side with a choice: escalate in kind, alter the objective sought through force to reflect the changed circumstances, or negotiate to end hostilities. This choice that escalation by one side imposes on the other in war is one of the main ways in which war is not totally under the control of any one belligerent. The use of reciprocal force to impose one's will on the unwilling has a tendency to escalate. The escalatory tendency of interactive violence, or what I call the logic of force, exerts influence independent of the political situation. This logic can also apply prospectively. If there is a realistic prospect that an insurmountable escalation will occur, this can produce a willingness to negotiate on the part of one of the belligerents. This is what Clausewitz means when he writes that while war is the continuation of politics by other means, politics is not a tyrant in war, but must adapt to the special character of its means: violence. It is not then that military officers are narrowly concerned with military operations and that this causes them to forget other political, diplomatic, or economic means that can also be used. Rather, they are concerned with the reality that no matter the political object, escalation requires counter-escalation to attain that object by force or resist an adversary's attempt to impose their will. When we appreciate this unpredictable aspect of war, it becomes clear why such an interaction should not be entered into lightly. The unpredictable reality of war that the military realist internalizes contributes to what some call military conservatism about the use of force. The reciprocal use of force has an escalatory tendency, as I've already mentioned, that cannot be downplayed or overlooked. This is one of the military realist insights that Eisenhower learned through 2 world wars and brought with him into the Oval Office. The experience and preparation of war instills this principle into the minds of military officers. Lacey and Murray put it succinctly in the introduction of their edited volume, Supreme Leadership in Modern War, which I recommend very highly to anybody who's interested. It just came out. Quote, once war erupts, its course is always an open question. Starting with the battlefield, where chaos and chance reign supreme, outcomes are often unknowable. That uncertainty does not end with the battlefield, however. At the level of strategy, where the chance inherent on the battlefield meets with the unpredictable nature of politics, it is impossible to say in advance how war will impact the passions of the peoples engaged. Vladimir Putin and even Ukraine's supporters were taken aback by the ferocity with which the Ukrainian people resisted Russia's attempt to absorb their country. Once unleashed, the impact of war on political communities cannot be predicted in advance. Both the escalatory and interactive character of war and its many frictions make war a highly unpredictable enterprise. Its use, therefore, should be considered carefully. As Eisenhower himself put it, every war is going to astonish you in the way it occurs and in the way it is carried out. Anyone who claims otherwise exhibits their ignorance of war. Echoing Eisenhower, General Stanley McChrystal summed it up nicely when he said, "For me, war is sort of like something radioactive that you shouldn't touch unless you've done a tremendous amount of understanding of just the damage that it will do." The second part of the military realist mindset reinforces the first. Part two of this mindset is a keen awareness of the intense physical and psychological friction that always accompany and impede the use of force. Physically, war involves the movement of soldiers and materiel across hostile terrain in order that those forces might fight in a coordinated manner to achieve a specific objective. An unexpected rainstorm might delay the arrival of a force essential to victory and scuttle the best laid plans. If the battle is a decisive one, such an unlucky turn in the weather could imperil the life of a whole political community. Psychologically, war involves intense risks to the life and limb for the soldier and to the interests and even survival of the state. By nature, human beings flee from danger and death. Yet war requires them to intentionally place themselves in the path of these perils. For officers, ordering people to engage in actions that will cost some of them their lives is an incredible responsibility, involving sometimes crippling psychological pressure. As if these were not enough, while plans are being made, a hostile enemy, whose intentions and whereabouts can only be imperfectly known, lurks in the background. Because of these relentless frictions, the easiest thing in war is extremely difficult. The military realist knows that these frictions await anyone who decides to appeal to force to achieve their ends. Like its escalatory logic, the physical limits of force are present regardless of the specific political circumstances. One can prepare for them, but cannot completely overcome them or fully anticipate the role they will play. The uncertainty violence breeds and the friction of war help explain why military officers are often less optimistic about the efficacy of force than their civilian counterparts. As Robert Gates observed, the biggest doves in Washington wear uniforms. Military realism also helps explain a seemingly paradoxical element of military officers' views on the use of force. First, military officers tend to be cautious about initiating the use of force, and veterans as well. However, once the decision to use force is made, military officers and veterans prefer that the amount of force deployed be overwhelming. This makes perfect sense from the perspective of military realism. War is so unpredictable, prone to escalation, and full of frictions that military realists are circumspect when it comes to using force. Once force has been selected as the means, however, the military realist recommends the use of overwhelming force because only a strong military force will have the flexibility to respond to unforeseen escalation by the adversary and the unforeseeable frictions that always plague military forces in the field. Lacey and Murray again, quote, "As Napoleon quipped, God is on the side of the big battalions," meaning it is usually much safer to bet on the side with overwhelming force and military power, end quote. From the perspective of military realism, then, these seemingly contradictory views of the use of force are perfectly compatible and reinforcing. The nature of war is such that it should only be entered into with a great deal of deliberation. and war is such an unpredictable endeavor that all available resources should be provided to deal with the frictions and setbacks it always has prepared for its practitioners. On January 21st, 1953, Eisenhower's first day in the Oval Office, he noted in his diary that he had, quote, plenty of difficult problems to deal with. However, the type, breadth, and depth of those problems were very similar to those he had been dealing with for much of his career. From Eisenhower's perspective, the problems he faced as president were, quote, like a continuation of all I've been doing since July 1941, even before that. Eisenhower confronted a major international crisis before he even took up the presidency officially. As promised on the campaign trail, as president-elect, Eisenhower traveled to Korea and inspected the battlefield there. He brought with him General Omar Bradley, his World War II subordinate. There, Eisenhower overflew the battlefield, which had ground down into a war of attrition. The leaders of the forces there, Clark and Van Fleet, presented Eisenhower with what Bradley called a MacArthur-esque victory plan. Eisenhower was unimpressed and dismissed this approach to ending the war. He said, "Gentlemen, I understand how you feel militarily, but I have been elected to end this war, and that is my decision." Eisenhower was unimpressed. He told the commanders that he had been elected to end the war and not prolong it by expanding military operations that would have uncertain results. To end the war, Eisenhower, however, appealed directly to the logic of force. He let it be known through diplomatic back channels that if the Chinese and North Koreans did not come to the negotiating table, he was willing to release tactical nuclear weapons into the hands of US military commanders and expand the war to include targets inside mainland China. The prospect of this massive escalation and Eisenhower's reputation for frankness drove the Chinese and the North Koreans to the negotiating table. Eisenhower, the military realist, presented his adversary with an escalation out of all proportion with their political objectives. In an NSC meeting, moreover, Ike showed that he was serious about his nuclear threats and did not think that the use of tactical nuclear weapons would lead to an all-out nuclear war between the superpowers. In one NSC exchange, Harold Stassen brought up the issue of using tactical nuclear weapons. Eisenhower referred to a diagram he had seen that morning that a 2-kiloton tactical nuclear weapon would produce, quote, only 1/20th of the damage wrought on Tokyo by the firebomb raids of 1945. Quote, it therefore seemed silly to the president to think that a resort by the United States to the use of these small tactical nuclear weapons would necessarily start a general nuclear war. Eisenhower was serious about his nuclear threats and prepared to deploy the weapons to the forces in the field. He would later say, "We tend to focus too much on words and not on the dark necessity of deeds to back them up." I'll leave it there. Thank you.
We now have about 20 minutes for questions.
Right. Well, I think Truman proved to be more realistic in his assessment of the Soviet threat. What did, of course, invite Churchill to Fulton in March of 1946, to deliver the so-called Iron Curtain Address, though Churchill's own title for that speech was The Sinews of Peace. which is, I think, an important thing to think about. And that speech is generally viewed as very combative, rhetorical opening shot of an unwanted Cold War. But if you read the speech itself, it's actually a program for peace. And Churchill characterized that always as his main objective, is to secure peace in the world, which is also what drove his second premiership. He was always trying to get a summit negotiations with the Soviets. Upon Stalin's death, they thought perhaps that was a golden opportunity, but that didn't materialize either. So Truman, I think, was more realistic. Of course, the reaction to Churchill's address in Fulton was quite negative among liberals in America and elsewhere. But then not long after that, Churchill said, if I delivered that same speech today, it'd be viewed as a strain of platitudes. So America, of course, quickly came to accept that he was pretty much right, which was kind of a pattern for Churchill, as he pointed out in that speech. I've not always been wrong, he said, so you might want to listen to me. Yeah, so in that sense, perhaps FDR's demise, you could say, led to a more realistic assessment of the Soviet threat.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the decisive, at least and interestingly, President Grant is undergoing a same revival right now. People are starting to appreciate his, and I actually just published a piece on his foreign policy, which has often been underappreciated. That was intentional on Eisenhower's part. We know, especially from Fred Greenstein's book, The Hidden Hand Presidency, which I recommend to anyone. It's one of my favorite historical / political science books. Basically, that Eisenhower knew what he was doing the entire time, and the view of him as the old fuddy-duddy was a persona that he cultivated. He would actually insert grammatical errors into his speeches to try to make himself look dumber than he was.
1980, I think.
73? Greenstein's book?
1980, I think.
Oh, it's that late.
Yeah,
82.
Holding the Line, I think.
It's one of the best. I mean, the only book that Greenstein writes another book called How Presidents Test Reality, which I absolutely love, where he compares Eisenhower's approach to the French Indochina War with LBJ's approach to Vietnam. Obviously, very different approaches. But yeah, it's that book, I would say, has been decisive in bringing in raising Eisenhower's reputation, and also the declassification of a number of key documents from NSC meetings, where it's clear that Eisenhower is the final decision maker in almost all the major policy. And also, I think a lot of people like to say that Dulles was really leading things, right? Which everybody likes because he's sort of like the Ivy Leaguer, right? And Eisenhower's the little boy from Abilene. But it's also clear from those meetings that Eisenhower often disagreed and dismissed things that Dulles said and some of his recommendations. Great question. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the distinction between those presidents who had supreme command, for about 10 years removed from execution, and those who had positions of command but not nearly as lofty. Why, for example, John F. Kennedy had command of men. William McKinley would have as well. Why is there less of this realism on the part of those who were down the era?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I thankfully address in my book. So One of the things I'm interested in is actually one of the things that Tom was talking about in terms of strategy, right? Is that these leaders are leaders that led at the nexus of war and politics. And I'm interested in a revival of strategic thinking in the United States, especially because I think we've kind of lost it. Both, I think the military side is often too focused on operations and making perfect plans, and the politics side is too focused on aspirations and not on how we actually get things done. So that's one of the reasons I focus on strategic leaders. But also they're the ones who are at that nexus, so they have that, they understand how military means and politics play out together. But I think one of the simplest ways to think about it is people who are working at the tactical level have almost no idea what's going on in the actual war, right? I mean, I don't think Kennedy knew, what were the implications of what he was doing in the war, right? Similarly, the soldier on the Civil War battlefield who's surrounded in smoke and can barely see where the adversary is, has very little notion of what the strategic implications of their actions are, right? So, but there is a significant amount of evidence, though, that people who have direct combat experience tend to be more cautious about the use of force than people who come to be heads of state with no military experience whatsoever. I hope that answers the question. It's actually a complicated question, but.
Since this hinges on what Professor Bruscino was talking about, maybe you would add to it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this is that point about I would sort of argue that the stuff that Dr. Campbell's talking about it tends to be more in the policy realm, sort of the transition from, and the separation is because separation is important. That was this key thing. So, but as you say, there's a necessity for a revival in kind of both realms. So the strategy internal to war, let's say that that besides the escalation tendency, I think there's like a mitigating factor on that. If you can't escalate to match the enemy's escalation or to get to your things, you said you can change the objective, you can negotiate, but that's also the space where there's room for creativity. Right, so like, and kind of one of the points I was trying to make in this is that, whatever ideas you have, if you have somebody else who's looking at it from a different angle, and you might be like, you're dead wrong about this, then you go, that's kind of interesting now, I mean, like, Hap Arnold is like actually sending, he actually sends John Dean, who's the military attaché to the Soviets, and he sent pretty early in the war, and he's like, hey, can we put bases in, air bases in Siberia or in the Russian Maritimes, so we can start, we could use those. Thinking about this, trying to figure out other ways to get it. So you start getting these kind of, oh, that's interesting. What does that mean? How would that work? And those kinds of questions allow you to do stuff. And I think that to this kind of point of being in the these high positions. I mean, I guess our sample's kind of small, but I would argue that I think George Washington is the greatest human being in human history. I think that Ulysses S. Grant is the greatest general in world history, and I don't think it's close. And I think we still don't understand all that he did in the Civil War, especially in the last year of the Civil War, which is it's stunning if you actually get into it, read it, and get away from the kind of drunken butcher idea or whatever that he's just bulldog tenacious. It's total misunderstanding. And my dog is named Ike, so I'm a fan of. I think there's three of the most talented, some of the most talented human beings ever. So it's it's sort of hard to say. We haven't had a supreme command type person who didn't do well in presidency. I don't know if there's some way to disprove the point. It's sort of a hard one in this case. That there is a certain amount of inherent abilities in these folks. So and I would also just add too that there's certainly in Eisenhower's case, and this goes to the other question too. In Eisenhower's case, he's got that. He doesn't care about his reputation as president, right? No matter how his presidency goes, he's the guy who, he was the Supreme Commander in World War II. He ordered D-Day. He did his thing. He's like, somebody like a Kennedy has to make his reputation as president. He's not going to be remembered for crashing his PT boat. As much as they wanted to, as much as he kind of wrote it into his heroic story, he kind of also screwed up. So, there is that, McKinley's not going to remember for his activities as a captain in the Civil War. So you have to kind of, there's a certain amount of this is, I worked myself to this position. I want to do this. Eisenhower's like, doesn't matter. Like, I can act like a dude, because I can act like I spent my whole presidency smiling and golfing, which is what the sort of reputation was forever. Like, it's asleep at the switch. Like that was not the case, and he didn't care because he knew that being historically minded, he knew that eventually the records would be out there, and Fred Greenstein will write a book about me and say that I was in charge the whole time. So yeah, I think that there's some of that too.
Yeah. Can I just add some to that? I really love that observation. One of the things I saw across all three of these leaders is they were humble enough to take direction from subordinates, right? And so they would get in these conversations, Washington, Grant, and Eisenhower would get in these really sweeping conversations where they'd allow all sorts of other people's ideas to come in, right? One of my favorite stories is when Grant writes an entire plan for Sheridan to execute in the Shenandoah Valley. And he goes to Sheridan and he says, before Grant even starts speaking, Sheridan sets out his own plan. And Grant says, I never took my plan out of my pocket. Right? Because he said, and there's also instances where, he made a decision and one of his subordinates said, don't do that. And Grant said, well, thinking that was a better idea, I rescinded my order. And you see that across all three of these leaders is a humility and an openness to alternative ideas that was vital, I think.
I suppose there's that disposition too, like Richard Burkett talks about in Founding Father, about the biography of George Washington, that I also highly recommend. It's kind of like this kind of father disposition. At some point, I could step in and do this for my kids. Like in my country, for these subordinates, the people are going to replace me. But if I keep doing that, they'll never learn it themselves. I think they all have a little bit of that too. It's like, hey, there's going to have to be. I'm not going to be here forever. They all have that kind of long-term view too, I think. That's part of it.
I saw the red sweater before.
Yeah. But any of you, they don't seem to be collaborative at all. He can have strong personality and given ordinary freedom. Arthur was almost untouchable. Old Marshall wasn't governed by. But how do they work? At least that's my perspective.
Yeah, so what I would say about King is he dictated Navy issues that were within his the responsibilities that were granted to him, the authorities that were granted to him. So and he had a lot of leeway on stuff, and he was very, very capable. I'm aware, the joke is that he shaved with a blowtorch. So he was, they would like the sons of bitches when a fight breaks out. He's that guy. When it came to, he argued very hard for his points about stuff. I mean, like he says he came into the meeting with a sword one time, like that sort of kind of idea. But like a lot of the stuff, and he didn't get what he wanted all the time. And at some point he sort of saluted smartly and did his job within the sort of, when there were decisions that, the president took, or he tried to, or he would go into somebody else's realm where their authorities belong to them. Like Arnold could tell like King to go away. Unless the president changes the authorities that I have right now, I'm not dedicating those forces for you. On the MacArthur case, so he's tricky, right? Because he's all over the place with his stuff. But for example, he did play ball, so in the Luzon attack itself, because the Luzon order was not just Luzon, it was Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and because Nimitz had to lent MacArthur stuff that Nimitz needed back to do Iwo Jima and Okinawa, particularly Iwo Jima.
MacArthur drives Walter Krugler, his subordinate, extremely hard on Luzon to tell him, go get to Henderson Airfield because we need to provide our own air cover so that the Navy ship, naval aviation, the carriers that are providing air cover can go back to Nimitz and so that he can go to Iwo Jima. And and Krugler talks about it. He says, he made me expose my flank. That Japanese were all in the mountains and to the east of us, and he's like, I don't care, go. And so he's on, he's playing ball. Like he knew that he had gotten, kind of what he wanted, but there were conditions part of it, so he plays ball with that pretty well. Now he's kind of a loose missile on his stuff. Montgomery, a little tricky. I kind of go with Carlo D'Este's book on Patton about this. That we tend to. Similar phenomenon in the European theater. We tend to emphasize the debates among these guys. But Carlo D'Este talks about 95% of the issues, they're all on the same page. They're all doing the same thing. We like the stories of when they're arguing with each other and Montgomery's being a turd, which he would, and new stuff. And then there's also that little British thing, the British sort of, how in Parliament they're arguing with each other and we all like to watch it and they're all maniacs and we're in America side, them's fighting words. We go outside, or we literally cane you, in there, you go to, they finish doing those things and they go drink together. They're normal, that stuff. So there's a kind of win the argument at all costs thing. Even if it means lying, even if it means lying in your memoirs, because the records won't be released for 75 years, it doesn't matter. So I'll just so Montgomery, so there's this exaggerated argument style that the British do that they kind of bleeds into their memoirs. It's not really in the American memoirs. Americans try to actually be as honest as possible. You can see it in most cases, and when they're not being, like MacArthur's reminiscences, you're like, yeah, he's lying. But this stands out. It's sort of harder. So I just think that they generally got along much better. And you sort of see, Montgomery had he's almost in tears, fawning over Eisenhower. This guy he thought was an idiot and should have been boss the whole time. The guy was amazing. So I think they mostly got along with each other. And MacArthur said it gets tricky, and that's why he's so hard to deal with historically, because there's times where he's just off the reservation, obviously in Korea. But even that's a specific thing, because what he's arguing for in Korea is outside of his realm of responsibility. He's trying to make a policy decision. And Truman says this clearly, even in his memoirs. He's like, this is policy. He tells him, this is policy. This is my call. You want a war with China. We're not fighting a war with China. That's not, asked and answered. And he keeps trying to sort of play in that realm, and that's the case. And he gets relieved over it. And all the other guys are like, yeah, let him go. I know he was our boss. We know he's a half generation older than all of us. And he gives chief of staff. He's got to go. So.
We have time for one more question. John, I saw your hand.
I love Federalist 70. And I think Federalist 70 and a lot of what is written in the Federalist Papers is inspired by Hamilton and Washington's experience in the Revolutionary War and the dangers of fighting war by committee. That's why, one of the reasons you get such a powerful executive in the Constitution. I think Eisenhower was energetic, but Eisenhower also did not want to start World War III if he could help it. Because he knew that it would almost certainly involve the use of at least tactical nuclear weapons. So he was energetic actually in the realm, probably most famously, of covert action. Because one of the ways that he wanted to avoid major conflicts was by using covert action to end conflicts, or to end potential conflicts before they started. So I think he was quite energetic, but he was really quiet about it. Right? He tried to there's a reason it's called the hidden hand, right? He wanted to be quiet about it. And I'll say this one last thing about Eisenhower. This is one of my most favorite stories about Eisenhower. Sorry, we'll run over time a couple seconds, but Eisenhower becomes president of Columbia University after he leaves the army, but before he becomes president of the United States. And he gets tons of fan mail from Americans. And he goes to the political science department, and almost all the fan mail is saying, you need to become president of the United States. And Eisenhower, again, this is totally belies this idea of he doesn't know what he's doing. He takes all the letters to the stats people in political science, and he says, I want you to break down all these letters and tell me why the majority of these people think I should become president of the United States. So he puts the researchers to work. They comb through all these letters. And the big conclusion is that the American people see him kind of as the opposite of MacArthur, right? That he's militarily effective in a dangerous time, but he's not militaristic, right? That he's not enamored with the idea of war. And so this was one of the things that really attracted people to Eisenhower. So I think he was energetic, but also, circumspect about the possibility of World War III because of how powerful the Soviet Union was.
Okay, well, if you could join me in thanking our panelists. We are now going to be recessing for a lunch break. Our third panel will start at 1 o'clock.
Great job. That was really good.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, great job. I love the maps. That's really, I've never seen that before.
Yeah, I wish I had maps. I didn't think to bring maps.
How long have you been at Cedarville?
This is my 8th year.
Okay, because I was at Cedarville last year.
Oh, you were?
I gave a talk for the Alexander Hamilton Society.
Okay, yeah, I did.
Cyber defense.
Right, yeah, the big thing
Yes.
we're developing, yeah. Yeah, I wasn't at it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was civilian.
Oh, you're a Navy guy.
Well, my son's at the Naval Academy.
Seth Heyman, or
Yes.
Two sons at the Citadel.
I feel like the guy I talked to was
That's all right.
I teach next to a young lady.
intelligence.
She was in logistics.
Um,
But anyway.
we have a couple of
my question
retired
to you is,
Air Force colonels.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
Anyway, it was a great. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
we're debating,
well, we're kind of, allied institutions, I would
Yeah,
say.
absolutely. I had never heard of it.
Yeah.
Until I got the invitation, but I really enjoyed my
much of
time.
that
Great
was
students.
to liberate Western Europe from the.
This one is? I hear something like his. Yeah, okay.
Save Western
I'll keep my politically incorrect comments.